All right. So 61, we might be a couple minutes late. We just found out that the computer doesn't have the right time, but that's all right. We'll get through it. But I'm going to blame it on not having Josh. Wherever Josh is at, he's not here tonight, so I'm dual rolling it. I think we can figure it out. But tonight I have a very special guest. I would say probably one of our most influential guests on what we've talked about with what Ports with Patriots came about and talking about veteran suicide, PTSD, and things like that. So tonight we're joined by, it's a small part of his career, so we'll talk about former Air Force captain, Bryan. But Craig is a board-certified clinical psychologist with expertise in cognitive behavioral treatments for individuals experiencing suicidal thoughts and post-traumatic stress disorder. As a military veteran, he deployed to Iraq in 2009. He has expertise working with military personnel, veterans, and first responders. His military service has had a significant impact on his clinical work and research focus, shaping the questions he asks as a scientist, and his understanding of the stresses and problems that his patients experience. Working in mental health has allowed him to help people find and create meaning and purpose in their lives. Craig has his Master's of Science degree in clinical psychology, a doctorate of psychology and clinical psychology from Baylor University. That's interesting, Texas. We got to talk about where he picked that. And completed a clinical psychology residency at Wilford Hall Medical Center at Lackland Air Force Base, Texas. He received a graduate certificate in applied statistics from Penn State. How does that work being at Ohio State, having a Penn State thing, but we're interested in that. And author of 3 books. Hopefully we can talk about one book, I think, mainly.
Sure.
The most current one, but he's authored 3 books: Rethinking Suicide, Why Prevention Fails and How we can do it better, which was published in 2021. Brief Cognitive Behavioral Therapy for Suicide Prevention, which was written in 2018, and Managing Suicide in Primary Care, which was 2010, right? So
That's right.
Welcome, Craig.
Yeah.
Good to have you. I mean, I can't make fun of you with your professional psychology part, but I have to make fun a little bit about being in the Air Force. But you were a psychologist in the Air Force, but I can't make fun of that then. So welcome. But, I'm glad to have you on.
Thanks for having me.
So we'll start off. You listened to a couple episodes. We'll start off with growing up. Not an Ohio guy.
No, I'm not. No, grew up in St. Louis, Missouri. So not too far away. Grew up there and then went to college actually in Southern Indiana. And so, had come and visited Ohio plenty of times with friends, fraternity brothers, things like that. So it wasn't too far off the beaten path, so to speak.
So growing up, any brothers and sisters? Yeah,
I have one younger sister. She still lives in St. Louis. She is basically a caregiver for young children.
And I mean, growing up, you have an interesting. So Craig, I think you might have the second direct commissionee.
That's right.
So a little bit different than what we talked about. If you haven't listened to some episodes in a while, but direct commissionee means that you pursue a degree, you have a specialty in something using the medical field, and then you're commissioned into a branch with what your background is. So, like I said earlier, a psychologist. So when you was in the Air Force, so. With that being said, there's an interesting thing that one of your books you talked about military service. We'll get that. But anybody else in your family in the military before you?
So yes, I don't come from kind of like the classic or traditional military family. I had a cousin who was in the Army National Guard in Missouri. My uncle served in Korea. My grandfather was in the Pacific in World War II. So he had some service there throughout our family, but again, wasn't that, kind of a stereotypical military family.
Yeah, nothing that was like driving you to.
No. And, what's sort of funny in some respects is, if I didn't send you any pictures from high school, but, if I had, I was like the skater punk kid.
Oh, wow.
Had, long hair, I would dye it. I'd, like piercings and Jinko jeans and chains, all that kind of stuff. And so when I did, join the military many years later, everyone who knew me growing up was like, what the hell? Like that was the last person we would have expected.
He hit his head too many times skateboarding.
Yeah.
So, yours is a little bit different journey there, eventually got into the military, but like what drove you to pursue psychology at Evansville?
Yeah, I think my interest in psychology started in high school. I took a psychology class, my senior year, but I can remember being, just kind of interested, fascinated in just human behavior. An example of this is, it's like you're in a high school and in between classes, the crush of students comes out, and then you go to the end of the hall and there's like those two double doors, right? Well, one of the doors is closed and everyone tries to cram through the one open door. And it's like, why the hell doesn't someone just open the second door? And so those sort of like musings about just why do we do the things that we do was certainly present there. Then in college, when I was at the University of Evansville, I majored initially in physics, believe it or not. And about halfway through college, basically I was like, this math is hard. And I don't know if I can do this, but I was also taking psychology classes at the same time. And, by then I realized this is what I really want to do. And so, kind of switched my focus and started pursuing psychology at that point.
So being that you're an official psychologist now, back to that high school dilemma of why everyone rushes through only one door. What's your read on that now?
Social norms. We follow the herd.
That's a good answer.
Yeah. And so deviating from the group can be uncomfortable. We don't always think about it. We just kind of follow the herd, so to speak. Yeah.
So what's it said about the kid who's like watching that and then just goes up and opens the other door?
Well, there you have deviation from the norm, and they oftentimes become leaders. Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I feel like you just took that beach ball and just like smashed it. But especially at that time, you think about there's a lot of little things like that throughout your life that you, I never thought about that one, but it saw me smile when I do it because it is so true. Like the norms, I get that. And then high school, it's like super difficult too. It's still difficult no matter what age you are to really go against the flow, right?
Yeah. And part of it might be the discomfort of being the outlier. But also, I think it's probably just sort of built into us as a species where, you quite literally follow the herd because it's working. So why would I change course, so to speak? And there can be some comfort in, sticking with the group.
Yeah, because that whole scenario, you can just see it happening. Like you're watching that, you're just bouncing through, and then somebody'd be like, hold on.
Yeah.
Let me open the door. And they're like, shut up, you nerd, or whatever. You know what I mean? Like, we're making everything's fine. And then you're like, and then that person's like, oh, fine, I'm never gonna, never do it again. But yeah, that's a interesting way to look at some of the things that I guess you can look at a lot of things in the world like that.
Yes.
If you have that look, right? If you're looking at from the human behavior and what we're conditioned and what we're not conditioned to do. And
I think, some respects, I think we all do this, we observe, other people, family members, friends, or just even when we're out in public, people watch and we kind of speculate and we're like, that's interesting. You kind of talk about what's going on over there. And, again, for me, that was sort of the entry point because there are motivations, there are decisions that people make, and we're influenced by this, the context and the environment. And then, you kind of carry that out. And that's where eventually on the clinical side, I pursued a clinical path where that seeks to understand, when human behavior, motivations, psychological experiences can create problems for people. And if we can understand that, and then hopefully we can maybe correct it or at least kind of reduce the problems that come with those things.
So you go through your college days, you switch from physics to psychology, you find your forever job, your forever passion.
Right.
Guess, right.
Yeah.
So you finished getting your master's. You had that. What made you head to Baylor for your master's then?
Yeah. So, in the profession of clinical psychology, there's sort of like two kind of degree pathways that you can follow. The traditional one that most people are familiar with is the PhD. And then there's another degree that's less well known, which is called a PsyD, a Doctor of Psychology versus a Doctor of Philosophy. The big difference between those is a PsyD is more of a professional degree, kind of like a JD for lawyers or MD for physicians, where the idea is you're going to practice the discipline of psychology, whereas PhD, the training, education for that includes some clinical health services type of work, but also a lot of research, academic teaching, those sorts of things as well. So it's they're kind of these two different pathways that people can follow. And for me, when I was in college, I realized I was more interested in the clinical pathway. And so my advisor at that time, once I was thinking about going to graduate school, met with him, and I had never heard of a PsyD before. And he's like, you should look into this. And he gave me a list of reputable programs in the nation, and Baylor University was one of them. And so I actually had never heard of Baylor University before. And so I applied. And when I went down to interview, like a year after that, you just have that feeling sometimes when you're like on a campus, kind of like when you're buying a home, you just know this is the one.
Right.
And that was the feeling. I remember walking on campus of Baylor and saying, this is where I need to be.
That's a great campus. Waco, not that great, but
yeah. Well, I will say, I went to visit Waco a few years ago. I guess it was before the outbreak of COVID, but it was totally different than when I was a graduate student. And I was like, well, actually, it's a lot better than what it was when I was here.
Yeah, because I have the vision of Waco when I was, there stationed in like 95, 99 to Texas. And then like when I lived there 10 years ago, and then now all these places just explode. But it's the Waco was, I love Texas. I mean, Texas, I'm approaching like 10 years here. I'm 10 years in Ohio, so a few more years I'll live here. But I've lived in Texas my longest point of my thing. But
I lived in Texas a long time too. I mean, graduate school, then I commissioned, and so I was stationed in San Antonio. Was there for several years. Then when I separated, I stayed in San Antonio for a few years at the University of Texas Health. So I guess in all, I must have been. I guess I was there maybe almost like 10 years in Texas. I love it, and I just look for any opportunity to go back, especially San Antonio. I love San Antonio.
Riverwalk's a good place.
Mm-hmm.
Got a question though. Are you a football fan at all?
I actually don't follow football very much.
So you would remember though, like I had the argument, like everybody knows it's my favorite time of year. I can hate on OSU, but OSU and Michigan always talks about how it's the biggest rival. That's all anybody talks about in the world. I'm like, if you lived in Texas, they only talk about UT and A&M.
UT A&M.
Yep. Am I right? Nobody is like, are we getting together and watching the Michigan Ohio State game? So this guy is legit. He's proven my point that it's not like that, but it's definitely one of those Texas is a different place. I mean,
it is.
The only thing I don't miss about Texas is the heat, if I'm honest about it.
Yeah.
It is a cool vibe, the whole a lot of melting pot of people, good food.
Yeah, that was, that's part of the reason when people are sometimes surprised when I say I love San Antonio. I love to like retire there and go back. And when they ask why, I say it's just a great city, but I love the culture. I love that Southern Tex-Mex style, especially around, Dia de los Muertos and the culture around that. So it's great.
It's hard to find. I think that when you leave Texas, you're kind of like, it's not the same.
Yeah, we actually might have to go down to Texas in a couple of weeks to visit Lackland Air Force Base for a project that we're working on. And one of the rules that we have on our team at OSU, because there are a couple Texas residents there as well, as whoever goes to Texas has to come back with HEB tortillas. And so we going through security in the airport, they're usually like, what the, okay, tortillas, we get it.
At least you didn't get the Buc-ee's t-shirt. That's another move. You got to,
right,
you should have that in there. They got to come back with an authentic Buc-ee's t-shirt.
Yeah.
But they're out of Texas now. They're moving around now. They're in
they are.
Different states.
Well, there's one in Ohio now, from what I understand.
Is it up and running?
I think so. Yeah. One of my colleagues who's a diehard True and Blue Texan, she did a pilgrimage when it opened up.
You drive 4 hours just to go to Buc-ee's. It's crazy, but I do miss it. It's great. So you graduate there. You talked about, you kind of jumped ahead, and we talked about it before. So you finished your degree at Baylor, and all of a sudden, this is how I know I did the research on you, right?
Okay.
This is how I checked out. So you talked about in your book that you really had, the military wasn't on your radar, and I may not say his name right, but it's Dr. Copeland's.
Yeah.
Discussion on the consequences of war.
Yes.
That made you kind of change your whole mindset.
Mm-hmm.
So let's talk about that. And the other part I want to talk about before that, though, is that same paragraph you talked about at that point. Everybody was shocked, and you even said that you were not the military type.
Yeah.
So let's talk about that. What at the time you're how old? 20, 21, 20, no, probably 23.
Yeah. Early 20s.
Yeah. So what in your mind made you say that you weren't in the military? type of guy. I mean, other than the skater thing we've learned about,
right,
that,
yeah,
but that's
yeah.
a joking aside. But
yeah, like that, kind of the, push the boundaries, non-compliance, questioning the rules, authority, things like that, which is a streak that carries forward even to today in my mid 40s. And so that's kind of what I think stood out to people, aside from the clothing, right? But it was just like the personality type of like, are you sure? Like, you have to like listen to people and do what they say. And yeah, so it wasn't, necessarily like kind of totally aligned with who I was sort of as a person. So,
but I think I found a lot of it is like, a lot of people think that everybody that goes in the military is all about listening and doing what they're supposed to do, but you kind of find out quickly that there's a large percentage of them that really don't. Yeah, they don't like it.
Right.
They accept it for what it is and just like kind of fall in line. Is that
well, right? And one of the things I learned was, those who succeed in the military, even if they have that sort of nonconformity streak, they understand the purpose and the function of leadership, of hierarchy. And that's the thing where maybe you don't like it, but you understand that there's a reason why. Sometimes you just have to shut up and color. And perhaps there are other times where maybe it's less important. And that is something that I definitely took away from the military. I think it's still something that I appreciate now, that it's like how to know when is the right time to kind of fall in line. And then there might be other times where actually maybe it's okay. Maybe it's even better to push the boundaries and not kind of fall in line.
I think we'll talk about that later on. It's some of the stuff you're doing. But so let's go next to Dr. Copeland's that discussion. What about that made you to go from a guy who, I'm going along with my, following the normal civilian, road to being a psychologist, and then all of a sudden now you feel compelled to serve. What was so impactful about that?
Yeah. So the kind of time frame, right? So I was in my last semester of college when 9/11 happened. So I had one class left to graduate, and I was working graveyard shifts, like caring for like autistic adults. And so I get off work at something like 7 a.m., go home, go to sleep, wake up, and the world has changed. I was actually going on a date that evening, and it was my date who called, like, do you know what's going on? I'm like, what the hell are you talking about? I just showered. It's like, turn on the news. So that was kind of the last major event of, college for me. And then less than a year later, I was in graduate school, and the first therapy class that we took, Dr. Copland was our instructor. And so Dr. Copland, by then he was getting close to retirement. He was kind of one of those, he's in his 70s, kind of thin, lanky, he just had this like gravitas about him. Like he's like this sage, right? This like wisdom, embodied. And I remember the morning after the invasion of Iraq, we come into class, and before starting, like we normally do, he said, let's take a moment to talk about what's happening in the world right now. He's like, I'm getting towards the end of my life, and I've lived through wars, and I see what the consequences of war can be for the small percentage who carry the cross for the rest of us. And I don't think as a nation we are talking about what those consequences are. And so let's talk about that here today, because you're the next generation of psychologists, and it will be you who potentially help those who carry this cross. And I think you need to appreciate what this is all about. And so, we had this conversation about trauma, about the psychological casualties that come from war. And that certainly was not the moment that I said, I'm going to join the military. But in retrospect, I really do think that was kind of where the seed was planted. And then over the next few years of graduate school, my primary mentor, who's now a very good friend and collaborator of mine, he was a former Army psychologist. And for 3 years, he's like, you got to join the military. You got to join the military. You'd be so good at it. And so a few years later, as I'm going into internship selections, I interviewed with the Air Force. It was not what I expected, and it impressed me. And I think for me, the big decision was, I don't know, it's hard to describe, but there was this recognition that only a few hundred people, psychologists, raise their hand and join the military. Anyone can go work in a college counseling center or the VA or a private practice or something like that. But there's only like 200 military psychologists at any given time. And that was, I don't know, there was just something about that. It was sort of like stand shoulder to shoulder with the people who are really there getting dirty and suffering the consequences, that I don't know, just seemed important. And it was many years later when I was living in Utah, a friend who I knew who was an Army, I think he was an E7 at the time, as we're talking about it, drinking beers around the campfire. He's like, because I said, I don't know why. I just felt like I had to do it. And he's like, well, that's duty. Like, that's duty. And in there now, years and years afterwards, it kind of clicked. And I was like, that was what was going on all those years ago in graduate school, is a sense of duty.
Yeah, it's always interesting to hear those stories, because it does always come back to, duty and service to others. And it's just interesting to hear that is this episodes of 60 is why people joined it. They could be like from families that are hardcore military to, you had it back. Some people don't have it, but some people, majority of them do. And they can, I think at a certain point when you understand what duty really means and service, for me, it was like, you're compelled to do it. Like it just feels right.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Like anything else feels wrong.
Exactly. Right? I was going to say, it feels right,
yeah.
But not doing it is like,
it feels really wrong. Yeah.
Right?
And I think, it dives into, I think, and we can talk about that now or wait, but I think that's one of the questions I've asked other people is like, when you got out of the Army, what was the biggest thing about, losing your job, your identity, your friends, that I have that with identity, right? Because that's your identity to someone that serves. So when you get out, all of a sudden you're not serving your country. You don't have duty. You're working at, Amazon fulfillment center as a manager. It doesn't feel right for us. It doesn't feel right to me still at 51 years old. Sometimes if I really let it come over me, that's one of the things I gotta power down and be like, chill out. But I think that's more of what it is. It just doesn't feel right to do something else.
Yeah.
For me, at least, I don't know.
Yeah. And I think, the way that I've characterized this a lot, because experiencing myself when I got out of the military, one of the first early sort of civilian experiences I had out of the military, when I transitioned to the University of Texas Health San Antonio. So my supervisor, my boss, was actually a retired Air Force psychologist himself. And it was like, the first couple of months, that I'd been out, and I went into his office or something. And I don't remember now what I did, but I asked him permission for something. He just laughed at me. He's like, you don't have to ask for permission anymore. And I'm like, what? And he's like, just do it.
I'm free.
He's like, it's your job. He's like, I trust you. Just do it. Right.
I mean, I can take Friday off. It's not a big deal.
Right. Yeah. And so it's like, those sort of experiences for me, I think the, kind of the turning point of like, I'm out, was actually 4 years after I separated, because that was the end of my individual ready reserve commitment. I was in Utah at the time, and I remember opening up the letter from obviously the Department of Defense, and it was a letter to say, thank you for your service. You've fulfilled your commitment in the reserve. You are hereby discharged from the military. And I just remember holding it. I'm like, fuck, I'm out of the club.
Yeah.
It was, and my wife, who's a retiree, she served 20 years. I just showed her the letter. I'm like, I don't know. It like feels weird, like I still had my CAC, and all that kind of stuff. That was when it hit me. And I think, a part of perhaps what has maybe eased the transition for me was because so much of my work since I've been out has been funded by the Department of Defense. I continue to work with military personnel and veterans. And so I'm visiting installations a lot, so there's still kind of, connection to the community in that sense. But But working with many other veterans who have gone through that transition process, I've likened it. I think it's sort of like you've summited Mount Everest so early in your life, and the view is glorious and it's just amazing, the achievement that you've had. And so then you get out, and it's sort of like you're still mountain climbing, but you're mountain climbing everywhere but Everest. And I think you have to get to a point somewhere where you recognize just because it's not the summit of Mount Everest doesn't mean the view isn't beautiful from the top of this mountain. And the things that I do matter, and I perhaps am serving. My duty is manifest in a different way now. And maybe it's okay that everything isn't life and death like it was while we were deployed.
Yeah,
and
100%,
yeah, there's a goodness to the silence, right? And I think there is at some point, I think maybe all of us, hopefully most of us, like kind of recognize that, and we realize that working at the Amazon Fulfillment Center actually serves an important purpose.
Yeah, and I think it takes time. I mean, for some people, I think it's quicker. For others, it's definitely an individual journey, right? Because I haven't used it to climb Mount Everest, but I've said it's like you touch the sun, right? You went up there and and it was glorious because it burned, but it was great. But then you fuck, as bad as it was, I want to do it again. It was such a thing. So it gets really hard to, for some, it took me a long time I like how you said, to get out of the club, because that's what a lot of people who aren't in the military that listen is like, that once you're out of the club, you're out of the club. I mean, people move on. And it's really sad to watch. Like you can say connected. It's probably easier in today's world to do it to, social media and the way it is, but people move on. I mean, people that you were super close to, you blink and it's like 8 years later and they've stayed in, they've been for me, a lot of it was watching and knowing that other people were climbing Everest and I wasn't, right? Yeah. And I was like, man, I want to do that, right? And not looking at the bad part of Everest, how much it costs to climb Everest, the dangers associated with, when I'm, like you said, I'm in a really good spot. And if they were looking back at you climbing Everest, they'd be like, shit, I wish I was Che. I wish I was over there, not dealing with, that. And that took a long time for me to kind of change my perspective on, getting out of the club and not touching the sun. And I mean, there's still parts of me that, when you think about it, you're like, I really love that, you know what I mean? And I think a lot of it, not even that the Everest, there's a lot of, I think, I just recently started talking, thinking about this with some guys that I talked to, is there's a lot of power and a lot of looking good, feeling good that's associated with you being in the military. That a lot of people, if you're not in there, like the amount of power that an E7 and an infantry unit has is pretty powerful. I mean,
it is,
the impact, not only like just weaponry, but just the power over people, the ability to lead, to directly influence people. That's it's addictive. And it felt so good, it felt so good. As bad as it could be, but it just felt so damn good, right? And you just want to do it. It's like
while you're doing it, you're bitching and moaning the whole time, and then once you're out, you're like, man, I want to do that again.
I want to burn my hand again. It was so much fun. So let's talk about your military career. You like you said, you headed down and did your clinical psychology residency at Wilford Hall Medical Center in Lackland. I was going to make an Air Force joke about when you said to join the Air Force, but I feel like I can't make jokes with you because you've been pretty serious in doing this.
Oh, come on.
I mean, your buddy was an Army psychologist, and he still talks to you and collaborates with you, and you went in the Air Force?
Well, I mean, he's learned a lot from me, so,
And you notice we're collaborating. My name's on the book is what he wants to say. It's fine. Yeah. So what back to that, what made you finally go the Air Force route?
So, kind of considering, so for a psychologist, there are 3 options. There's Army, Air Force, Navy, right? And so looking at, we can talk about like the different cultures of each of the departments and services. And that sort of culture as a whole, I think also, kind of trickles down to like the, each of the medical corps. And one of the things that stood out to me about the Air Force in particular was this very strong, passionate dedication to a term that's like called evidence-based practice. What that means is doing stuff that has been shown to work. And so I think that really stood out to me, of this notion of, doing what you've been taught isn't good enough, unless you know that it's actually working. And so I appreciated that sort of philosophy. And at that time, 15, 20 years ago, definitely seemed much more salient than perhaps now. I think I think seeing how each of the services have changed over time, there's arguably less differences in that aspect of culture between the branches, at least for psychologists, as what there used to be. So that was the appeal.
So when you started that, what was, like, if you're talking about the philosophies or moods of the other branches, what were some of the other branches? What was your assumption of how the other branches were thinking, like the Army, Navy? What was their approach to the psychology part at that time?
I mean, I think the the kind of the feel, the vibe, or the culture of the Army. I mean, it's like, they get down and dirty. They're you're going to be out in the field, and you're going to be rolling around the dirt and the mud and all that kind of stuff. The Navy was I don't know. It's hard to describe, but it just the Navy psychologists and the field at the time was just like, it just didn't seem to gel with who I was as a person. It was almost like it was eccentric or something.
That's the Navy, though.
Yeah. Right now, many years later, right? I'm like, oh yeah, that's totally Navy, right? And so, yeah, and of course, having a mentor who had served in the Army, who was able to do that, who was at the time, Fort Hood, now Fort Cavazos, who was able to kind of say, no, that's probably actually not what you want to do, is go in the Army. You would be better.
So he knew about you there. He knew you were heading to the Air Force. What was his guidance to you about the Air Force? What was he saying to you? Or did you, as a mentor, were you asking him?
He was, I remember him, I remember him talking about like the notion of service. And it was sort of like he would say these things like, there's nothing like it in the world. That you'll never do anything more important in your life. And I get what he's saying now, but at the time I didn't fully understand that. But I got sort of this sense from him that there was like this really this really big sort of importance. There was something about military service that you don't get from other types of jobs or other workplaces. Yeah. So that was, I don't know, that stood out to me. It's like, I wonder what that's about.
So you once you left Lackland, headed to, you stayed at Lackland though, right? As a chief primary psychology service.
Yeah.
Doing that?
Yeah. So I was working in our family medicine clinic. And so, my title there was, I was the chief of the primary care psychology services. Yeah.
And then you finally make your deployment, move to Iraq in 2009, at a TBI clinic.
That's right.
At the Air Force Theater Hospital.
Yeah.
So you talked about, there's one thing in the book that the I didn't read the whole book, but I got the first 7 pages down pretty good about some stuff. But one of the things that, like, when it was interesting to read that, and why I'm looking forward to reading the book as part of my reading list here, and catching up to all the stuff that we'll hopefully talk about and touch base with tonight. But you talked about being there in Iraq and seeing some stuff that really started to hit on suicide that really kind of shocked me. One of them in particular, you talked about in 1 week time frame, you saw 4 service members who had taken their life. Yeah. While you were there. And I thought that when I heard that, I was like, honestly, was like, holy shit, like that's insane. Like, yeah. And just how you went in your career, and we'll talk about that more, that had to have a huge impact on you, seeing, yes, it's an impactful thing to see people, wounded in combat, the things, that happen in combat, that trauma there, but to see service members that in the theater are taking their own life, that must be very heavy. And you actually talked about in the book a little bit that it felt different to everybody when that happened. Yeah,
it was what I kind of talk about this 1 week that we had. there. We're at a Joint Base Blotter, LSA Anaconda. We're running the hospital, and I'm the only psychologist for the Air Force hospital. So I do rounds every morning with all the medical team. And so if someone like killed themselves in theater, they would be air evac'd, typically to our hospital or Baghdad, a little bit down the road. And then we would just kind of keep their bodies functioning in the ICU overnight. And then typically next mission out, the next day they'd be AE'd over to launch stool. And then reunification with family, organ donation, those sorts of things. So when suicides would come in, they were kind of like in and out pretty quickly. And then that week there was a sandstorm. And so all basically non-essential flights were grounded. And so we were receiving casualties, but the planes that were not taking off to evacuate unless it was life or limb type of situation. And so we had 4 suicide decedents. They were all soldiers, and they had all shot themselves in the head. And and it was a very, very impactful experience for me because as a psychologist, I work with suicidal people all the time. It was something I was kind of interested in professionally as like a thing to maybe specialize in. But when people kill themselves, usually at home, in their cars, things like that. So as a psychologist like myself, you don't see that. You learn about it usually when you call your patient and they don't answer, right? And the family member answers. And so, here was the first time for me, like really kind of coming face to face with that. I mean, it was the first time I'd seen dead bodies. And although these 4 soldiers had been cleaned up, we'd been taking care of them, you really could see just the viciousness of, gunshot wounds, especially to the head. And it was for me, I was like, oh shit, like this is violent. This is not pretty. And it was a very personalizing experience to me. It wasn't, a statistic anymore. It wasn't something that, again, happened somewhere else. And I think about that because, of course, I know I have plenty of medical colleagues, like emergency medicine colleagues, paramedics, things like that. They see this all the time. And so it's, for them, it's perhaps a different experience, but for me, that was a first. And I do remember standing at the foot of their beds because we put them all next to each other to make it easy to monitor them, and just kind of wondering, like, what the hell are we doing, and why are we not better at this, and what did we miss? And one of the things that I found when I was deployed, kept encountering these situations where people had killed themselves or attempted suicide, but they didn't have any of like the warning signs or the risk factors that I had been taught, as a professional through all of our annual suicide prevention briefings. It really seemed to kind of come out of the blue. And so meeting in some cases, I talk about like a Marine that I saw in the ED who survived actually a self-inflicted gunshot wound. And it like completely shattered everything that I assumed I knew about suicide. And that, I think, was a definite turning point for me in my career. It cemented my resolve to dedicate my work to suicide prevention. And, also trauma, because again, what I talk about this, like trainees or students, I'm like, here in the States, when someone comes in with PTSD, that bad thing happened years ago. In Iraq, it happened 2 hours ago. And you see a very visceral response sometimes that you don't see years and years later. So it was life transformative, and I think in a good way, because I think it helped me to understand the issue and to think about like research questions, clinical issues at a much deeper level than I think I ever would have otherwise been able to.
Yeah, I think we've had several guests on, and I've been critical about it too, about, the club, how the club, as you called it, was how they were how they take care of the situation. But, looking back and, having the degree you have and what you're seeing, I look at it from a different lens, right? Because a part of me is like angry about it. They didn't know how to, in 05, they didn't know how to, the person that talked to me in 05, or, 04, 05, they had no idea how to talk to me about what, what you've been through, what you've seen. You move forward to 09, you're like, man, we should have figured it out by then. But I mean, looking back at all the research you've done, like, I don't think we were ready for what happened. Right. I really think it was something that, like, I don't think we predicted what was going to be happening and the level that was going to happen. How do we deal with, people that are having those visceral moments, a couple hours later or a year later, which surprised me because it wasn't the first war we were in, and it wasn't, and we could talk about this. It could segue into some other things about your book, but the Vietnam veterans didn't handle this very well. Everybody talks about World War II veterans, but if you really dig into it, they weren't really handling it very well either. They were better at hiding it than anybody else. But that was the shocking thing. It was like, all the things we've advanced is to have, missiles that you could fire, 50 miles away and, land within, a 10-foot, I may not be exactly right, but like a 10-foot range, whatever, or like the just everything with weaponry and the ability to, like, take life and wage war has advanced so far. I mean, the lessons learned, but then when it came to something like that, it was like, it's not going to happen. We'll just use the same playbook and it'll be okay. And
right.
And it didn't. I mean, what I mean?
Yeah. It'd
be like, hey, everybody, we're guys, instead of, using a good tactic, we're going to fix bayonets today and we're going to charge this. You'd be like, what the fuck are you talking about? I feel like that's what happened with our mental health.
Yeah. It's funny because as you described that, it reminds me. So I mentioned before, my first gig out of the military was at UT Health San Antonio. UT Health Center San Antonio. And so my supervisor, Alan Peterson, who is an Air Force psychologist, he was one of the first psychologists to deploy. Actually, respond to 9/11, and then also one of the first psychologists to deploy to Iraq. And so he was like setting up the like tent hospitals, and he tells a story of how before he was getting ready to deploy, he was like furiously reading as many books as he could about trauma and PTSD. Because his like expertise was like smoking cessation, and things like that, like health issues. And so he gets downrange and, he was in essence kind of learning on the fly, how do you treat combat stress reactions? Because all of the literature, all of the research at that time had mostly been conducted with like sexual assault victims, domestic violence victims, child abuse victims, things like that. There really wasn't a lot known about military and combat trauma. And I think he was right in his logic. He said, this is the closest approximation we have. Something horrific happens. And so he's like, I don't know what else to do. I'm going to go with this. And now 15 years later, those early stages of those of us deploying downrange, kind of using these PTSD therapies that really had never been used in that way before, we're actually realizing, I'm like, yeah, that was actually a really good idea. And now, like what we do at Ohio State University, one of the programs that we have that is kind of like one of the, I think kind of like the gems in our crown, is we do this like aggressive 2-week PTSD therapy where we meet with veterans every single day for 2 weeks instead of, like the once a week therapy that's more common. And that idea came from Iraq. So like, when you're deployed, you don't have the luxury, all right, every Tuesday at 2:00 p.m., we're going to show up at my clinic for therapy. It's like, you're here, commander's like, you have 3 days, doc. They're either going home or they're back in the battlefield. And so we were cramming these treatments and these therapies in as quickly as we could. And it was working. We were returning people to duty and we brought it back. And now we're doing it here in the US. So it's this sort of weird, and another kind of lesson learned that many of us at the time were really quite literally just kind of doing the best that we could. And now years later, we're like, okay, we get it. And actually we should be doing this for everybody.
Yeah. And I had I heard a lot of like anger towards that, like those people that were talking to me, the military people, or even the civilian, like there's a bunch of anger because it's not there anymore, because you're like, how do you not know this? But there's still a part of me that looks back and goes back, like I look at, my dad's a Vietnam veteran. I grew up around that thing, and I watched that whole thing. And as you learn, if you're looking at that, how that whole thing went down for the veterans, it didn't go, it didn't go very well at all. But like, there was a part of that I feel like there's a part of we just ignored. Like we were like, why didn't we? And we could talk about this later. I don't blame that on the system. I blame that on those veterans as well, right? That they weren't, the same thing I talk about Veterans Day. If you don't want to talk about have the conversation, you're contributing to the problem, right? That's how I have it. But it was like it's like they didn't even prepare for it. Like it wasn't even. It was like some of it was on the fly. Like, and it was something that. When you look back, you're like, did it really need to be that way? I mean, I understand the leaps that we've made from 05 to 09 to like now. I think it's always getting better, but there's that gap. It was like, what did we think was going to happen?
Right.
Like, like we've seen all these same things. We know what's going to happen, but I just felt like it was like, we'll just
we'll figure it out.
We'll apply old ways of we'll. Because if you from the old time when I was in, I'm like, the worst thing could happen to you in the military was, when my time was in there, if you were struggling mentally to get sent to the psych ward for 72 hours, that was a career breaker. You know what I mean? And you look back now and you're like, holy shit! Like as a commander, I wasn't even worried about what was going on with that person. I automatically after that was like. And we'll talk about the mental health illness that is not undiagnosed. There's something wrong with you. You're not trustworthy. Not that you just other things that have collapsed on top of it. And you just having a bad time. And there's a way to get through that. There's a way to fix that. But I just feel it was an interesting. It's a great journey to see what's going on. But we can talk more about how, we need to keep pushing it further and further to change how it works, because I don't know if it's. You know more, but I don't feel like it's firing on the. It doesn't have the same focus that when we talk about the F-35 or like.
It's like this is one of my like beefs with particularly like mental health researchers, because they're like we have now. Okay, so there's like these therapies that are pretty damn good for PTSD, and we developed them after Vietnam. We learned the lesson from Vietnam, and we've been working to improve them now for 40 years. And so we have this handful of therapies that are actually pretty freaking good. Like something like 60-70% people who finish the therapy don't have PTSD afterwards. Like that is something that still like blows people's minds. Like, you'll never get rid of PTSD. I'm like, well, actually, there's some pretty good treatments now that used to not exist. But even though that's pretty good, 60%, it's not 100%. And so how do we move forward? This is a major focus of the research that I do now, where we're looking at, well, what if we like combine these different treatments in different ways? What if we do A before B, or maybe B before A? I don't know. And I found that like as a whole within the mental health research community, there's this mindset. I'm like, well, we already have the therapies. They work 60 to 70% of the time. So what the hell? Like, why would we focus on that? We should do something else instead. And my response to that is like, well, but we could get to 80%, right? And then maybe we could get to 90%. And I've tried to use the example of how we've made advances like in cancer research, where over like decades, just slow incremental advances where, these researchers just kind of twist the knobs and dials just a little bit to constantly eke out a little bit better survival, a little bit better quality of life. And so now we have some cancers today that are highly survivable, that we have really good treatments for that didn't exist 40 years ago. And I feel like we could do the same with mental health conditions like suicide, with PTSD, depression, other things. But I just don't feel like right now there's this sort of mindset of, those small little incremental gains are often dismissed as not really important. But over the long term, each little step forward gets us closer and closer to where we want to be.
So you're in that community, like I love what you said, because there's a couple things. The first part of that is you're exactly right. Like, 60% is good enough, but in everything else, when you come to the warfighter and the warrior class, let's rope in everybody else. There's technological advances that are going on that are insane. There's training that they're doing that's insane. It's crazy. 60% is not acceptable in anything else, but it's acceptable in dealing with the warfighter, who's the one that is doing all these things that is dealing with all these things. There's that mentality. You're right. Like 40%, if the 100 people, that's 40 people that took their life or are suffering with PTS or depression that aren't doing well. That's great if you're the 60, but it's really bad if you're the 40, right?
Yep.
Or you're the family of the 40. But yeah, I mean, that increment, I just never, I hope it starts to change. And I had a question here about that. And the second part of that is like, what do you think in your community is that holdup of saying, like, because no cancer doctor is going to be talking about, what are you talking about? We're 60%, survival rate.
Yeah.
I mean, they want to be 68, 70. I mean, you're right. They pushed, some of these cancers to like, you have cancer, it's no big deal. The odds are in your favor that you're going to survive. It wasn't like that 30 years ago. So why do you think that your profession is so stuck at saying 60 is good?
I don't know for sure, but I kind of feel like the mental health disciplines get really caught up in like fads. And so it seems like every few years there's like the new hot topic, and that's going to like save all of us, this panacea that comes out. And so there's this sort of like lack of strategy in some respects. And so right now the hot topics we're still kind of stuck in this whole like brain disease model, where it's all about like neuroimaging and like, taking pictures of the brain and all this kind of stuff, even though it's not a particularly reliable method to understand like psychopathology and mental disorders. Now the big things like machine learning and AI, it's AI everywhere at this point. And it's sort of like there might be some applications of these technologies and these tools that can be useful. But it's almost sort of like it's like a tool looking for a problem, so to speak, as opposed to focusing on the problem itself and saying, how can we improve like a resolution or a strategy to fix this? So it's, I think that just for whatever reason, my opinion is that the mental health disciplines just get really kind of caught up in whatever the hot kind of cool topic is.
Yeah, and I mean, I don't want you to think that I'm going after you, because I've read enough about you that you don't think that way. That's why I asked that question. So I know you're not happy with the 60%, and so I don't want you to take that personally. And I know that you have many colleagues that don't, but that's just one thing that when you look at what's going on, and there's so many, like you said, there's so many advances and so many things. It's just like, when are we gonna take, just grab the mold and break it and move on and just accept that what's not working, and because what's it going to take? Because that's my other part about it is where we're at in 2024. We'll talk about this as well. It can lead into something else, but the warrior class is absolutely killing it. Meaning, like, we're leading the charge, and something is mind-boggling, the amount of people that are in the warrior class, military, first responders that are taking their life on a daily basis. It's crazy. So that this huge, I call it an epidemic. It is an epidemic. It's happening. And one of the things that, like, listening to you today, that I didn't even realize I'd heard it before, but it kind of hit me again, is like, not only is the warrior class leading it, but the United States is leading the way. So what is it going to take for that this field to be like, this isn't working? I mean, we're not going to run the ball right off the guard every play for the whole quarter. We need to change it up. It's not working. What is it going to take? Because to me, that's why I started this, is something is not working. Like, something is not working. I knew it wasn't working for me, but you just watch and see people that they're taking their life. It's like something needs to change. We need to throw away the playbook, maybe, or I mean, rip about 100 pages out of it. I don't know.
I'll say, I wish I knew what it would take, because I would do it.
No, I would too. I mean, I know, but it's just a philosophical thing. I'm not asking you to, like, I mean, I wish to God you could bring it out. We'd be huge. Just to be a huge podcast if you could tell us the reason why.
It'd be the holy grail,
but I mean,
right?
But that's just the mentality. Is I just feel like everybody should be feeling that way. And I'm not saying that they don't. I don't want to attack like the.
Well, I think what it is like the way I sometimes feel that, what causes us to get stuck is that we care so much about being right that we lose track of whether or not we're effective. And so there's, within the suicide prevention field, my critique, like what I talk about in the book, it's like we just insist, well, we need more screening, we need more awareness, we need more, I'll refer more people to mental health care. And despite more awareness, more effort, more screening, the trend lines are not moving in the right direction. And so at some point, we should probably look at that and say, yeah, maybe this isn't working. But what's interesting is that right now, I find that the mindset is like, no, this is the right way to do it. We just need to do more of it. We're just not doing enough. And it's almost like it's this feedback loop, right? Where the more we do something, the worse it gets. And then that just confirms, oh, we need to keep doing more. And so I use this when I do a talk, kind of based on the book. And I have the story in the book as well about Abraham Wald, a mathematician in World War II who played a pivotal role in saving lives of military air crew, where he basically, so his story, I guess I shouldn't like leave people hanging here, but like Abraham Wald was on this task force for the military that was charged with trying to prevent bombers from being shot down over Central Europe so they could save lives. And so basically what they did is all this research, what they said, hey, we need to put more armor on the planes. Well, where should we put the armor? Well, let's collect data. So every time bombers would land on airstrips in the UK, the little researchers would come up with their clipboards and draw where the bullet holes, all this kind of stuff. And so there were these patterns, these like famous images of like these bombers where there's like a clustering of bullet holes, like, in the center of the wings and all this kind of stuff. And so based on that, the task force said, this is where we should put all the armor because that's where all the bullet holes are. And then Abraham Wald stepped in and said, no, we should put the armor where there are no bullet holes, because the question is, why are there not bullet holes in those locations? There should be, because you're Germans on the ground shooting thousands of feet in the air. They're not that accurate. There should be bullet holes everywhere. Well, the missing bullet holes are at the bottom of the English Channel. And so we have to then kind of look through, the ideas, look through the data to see what might be invisible to us. Because otherwise, I think you get caught in these feedback loops of doing the same thing over and over again without really seeing any change. And that's what could have happened in World War II. The military could have armored up the wrong parts of the plane and then just kept saying like, well, I don't get it. We need more armor.
But
right?
yeah, I read that part, and then I saw one of the things where you showed the slides and talked about that. And the funniest thing about it is when you listen to that, it's a very serious topic. I don't mean to laugh about it, but it's like when you look at it, the funny thing you said is like, when it didn't, what were the military doing? Even before you could say it in the podcast, it's like, you just put more armor on those same spots. That's what they would do.
Right,
and I'm like, and that is the total mentality, the feedback, the negative feedback loop. And I think, when the dangerous thing to me is like, I think, for me as a person, and when I was, my struggles with PTSD and things like that, I was in a negative, that feedback loop, right? So if I'm in that feedback loop and the people that are treating me in the feedback loop, it doesn't really help. Like, that's what I'm saying. And I know you don't have the answers, and I'm not trying to, like I said, shit on other people that are doing great work, because I think people are. I just think to me, it's like why I started this a couple of years ago and want to bring veterans and talk about it, is to see if whatever we can do to help, right? If somebody could say what really does, like if it works for one person, if you say something and it works for someone not to take their life, that's a success for me. That's how that's how I look at it. But it's one of those things where I just, I don't have any anger for it. It's more of curiosity now, and then just like a passion to be like, okay, we got to keep pushing what's going on. But like that is a total mentality. I had that written down to bring up in the book. And if you don't want to read more of that, that's out of his most recent book, which is Rethinking Suicide, Why Prevention Fails and How We Can Do It Better. So that graphic was great, but I was laughing so hard on that, because that's exactly, just keep putting more.
Oh yeah. And whenever I do that with like any military audience, everyone's like way ahead of me on that. Yeah.
But when you look at that, you look at that picture, and like, that was the first thing I knew, kind of like, read through that, and didn't know in detail. And that's what I was going to ask you about, more to explain it. But then when I saw the video, I'm like, as soon as I saw that graph, I'm like, yeah, that's simple. The ones that had those holes in there, they obviously crashed, right? That something is in those areas that are super important that are causing to go down. But you know what I mean? It's just and they didn't get hit, but it is that, and you talked about that. So we talked about the planes and armor. Like, how do you look at that for, applying it to suicide prevention and
Yeah.
PTSD treatment? That's the part of the question I had. So
Yeah. So
we're not talking about armor, but
so it kind of gets back to, I was saying before, it's like, well, we need more awareness, we need more screening, we need more, referrals. And I think there's a time and a place for doing that. But I kind of feel like that's where we're stuck in the hamster wheel. And, the fact that we are broadening all these efforts and we're not seeing, change in the right direction would suggest to me that perhaps maybe that's not actually working. Maybe that is sort of the metaphorical putting the armor on the wrong places. And so we need to perhaps pivot and think of something different. And so there are a couple ways to do this. And one of which is, so if we think of like within the mental health care system itself, like, so the classic way, someone is not doing well, and so we need to get, they should go to like mental health treatment. We actually know now that there are a handful of mental health treatments that are way better than the traditional treatments that are widely used, when you go to like a local counselor or psychiatrist, something like that. But those sort of handful of techniques are not widely known. They're not widely used. And so that's sort of one area we should be doing more of that. And some of the work that, so here's how we did it at OSU. We basically said, okay, it's not enough to just tell everyone to go to the mental health clinic and get treatment. We need a clinic that specializes in PTSD, specializes in suicide risk. And that's like all you do. It's similar to other specialty healthcare. If you have a particular disease, you go to that guy who is the expert in that. And so we want to do the same on the mental health care side. And we use only these small number of therapies that have been shown again and again and again to be really, really effective. And we get really good results from that. And so it's as simple as it sounds, it's actually a pretty big departure from what's typical. The classic approach is, let's get all of the mental health professionals in our agency, our community, and we're going to train all of them with PowerPoint, workshops. And then we'll just hope that they do it. And they don't. And it's partly because the training itself is not enough. You need ongoing support. You need supervision. But also because in a general setting, you don't get enough people with trauma or who are suicidal for you to maximize your expertise. And so by setting up these like more specialty clinics, in essence, we populate them with experts and then we bring in the trainees. And the kind of funny thing about it is, some of our interns, like, they know more in 2 months working with us than many, kind of more senior people know after years and years of practice. Is because it's like, if you work in our clinic, you won't get anything other than suicide risk. And so you're going to learn really fast and we're going to supervise the hell out of you. And so that's kind of one example of how I think we need to change how we approach like mental health care treatment, just thinking more in terms of like specialists, as opposed to just everyone is, you just open up the yellow pages or Google someone and they somehow know how to treat everything that walks in the door.
Yeah, because they maybe, like you said, they're dealing with, alcohol cessation, sexual assault, like that. That's where they spent their. That makes sense. So you talk about Ohio State. We've had one of your former colleagues on before, Ken. So what are some of the programs those programs that you're saying at Ohio State that you think are working? Is that what you're talking about? STAR, is that one of the?
Yeah, so STAR's one of them. STAR was a program that I was involved with when I first got to Ohio State, and so they specialize in providing PTSD treatment for like crime victims. What we did after arrival then is we said, well, we want to be able to help a lot more people, like even non-crime victims, right? And so we created a parallel program called STRIVE, Suicide and Trauma Reduction Initiative, and we specialize in those two problems. And so we started with military personnel veterans because, myself, my wife were veterans, that we kind of brought in that expertise. But part of the appeal of coming to OSU was that we wanted to open the door. We wanted to help anyone who was struggling with suicidal thoughts. And we're doing that now. And so we have a clinic, a STRIVE clinic, and we have then research alongside of that. So actually, when when people come to us, whether they're referred to us or they, call us or email us, one of the first things that we usually ask them is, we can help you in our clinic. We'll bill your insurance or, however you're going to pay, just like normal healthcare. But you might also be eligible for research studies. And if you volunteer for research study, you could, in many cases, receive the therapy without paying for it. But then you're kind of, we're going to interview you. We're going to ask you to fill out questionnaires, things like that, because we're trying to make the therapies better. And so one of the cool things about what we've been able to create is now we have the clinic where we do the therapies, but we also are right alongside the scientists who are saying, maybe we could do this better. And as soon as we learn something new, it immediately gets pushed into the clinic. So a great example of this, last year, we published the results of a study where we took one of our suicide prevention interventions and we integrated it with our PTSD therapy. And what we found was that when we combined those two things together, not only did we get larger reductions in PTSD symptoms, we also reduced suicide attempts and suicidal ideation by half. And so the combination worked better than either one of them by themselves. And so now, if you come to our Strive clinic, if you have PTSD and you're having thoughts of suicide, you get this new integrated treatment that is not actually being offered anywhere else in the country, because like quite literally about a week after we analyze the data, we're like, this is how we're going to start treating our patients now. And so now we've got a new study to try to figure out, okay, how do we get even better?
All right. In that study, when you have people that come in there, what's your reception? What do you think's the percentage of people that are like, hey, you can, open up and question me? Like, is that getting more open that people are doing that? Or is it still, I just want to get the treatment, or how are people taking it?
That's a good question. I don't know what the split is. There's, I want to say probably about 50-50. I don't know if that's true. I'd have to ask one of my staff members who tracks the numbers, but we're certainly not hurting on either side, right, for volume. And I will say one of the interesting things is military personnel and veterans are way more likely to volunteer for research. And I think it's because of our value system of giving to others. And we hear so often, like, I don't know if this will help me, but it doesn't matter if it helps out another veteran.
Yeah.
And so there is this service to others that seems to fuel our veteran research.
Yeah, I think it's funny because I did ETMS, which you're familiar with, and like I had like somebody pushed me there, and I have it with anything like that now. Is like there's two part of it. Like I'm going to do anything now that I want to do that's going to help. Whatever nugget I can get to help myself, right? The pain is worth it a little bit. Yeah. But ETMS I was really excited for because it's also research that's going on to help. And like I hear all these things, and one of my big things is not sleeping. And people are like, oh dude, I slept like a baby after that. And I'm like, and I could not wait. And like it was my second treatment. And I had the worst headaches I've had in a long time. I was getting vertigo. It was just not going my way. So I had to actually get extended through it. And so the one doctor asked me, like, what is at the end of like, what do you like? What did you think was like your improvement? I'm like, I don't know if this helped me at all. I'm like, I still like, I know what your scans tell me, but maybe I was a little more focused in the afternoon. But I'm like, I had a headache. I didn't sleep anywhere. But she's like, then why did you do it? I was like, because if I can go through that study and do that, and you can capture the data and it helps somebody else, because I've heard it's been instrumental to a lot of people. I'm all for that. Like you got to keep doing that. To it didn't help me. Maybe I got 5% out, but somebody else is getting 80%. I'm like, I wish I'd been better at sleeping, but it really didn't help me at all. It's an interesting thing. But I think you're right about that. I think maybe that's the mindset, the warrior class, the warrior class of police officers, because they're going through programs like that to a lot of it. It should, number one, be if anyone's listening, it should be for yourself.
Yeah.
But if it is helping other people, I think that's always what is a good thing. But it's interesting. So that program, Star Strive, that you guys are here now, say, how much of that is Ohio State pushing out to other schools, other clinics? What's that move? You guys have something that's gaining momentum. It's not really what everybody else is doing. What's Ohio State doing, or Craig doing to?
So I do a lot. So we So I work with a number of organizations outside of OSU. So one, a big one that I work with is Stop Soldier Suicide. It's a nonprofit that provides free therapy to veterans struggling with suicidal thoughts. And so we've, over the past several years, through the generous support of USAA Foundation, we've been able to train a lot of Stop Soldier Suicide's mental health clinicians in these therapies, and we supervise them, we consult with them. And I've been able to help the organization kind of structure their services, their business model, things like that, to make this a lot more conducive. And so, all reports from them is that it has significantly improved the quality of their services. And I'll say those of us, the members of my team who are doing the trainings are like, oh my gosh, they're like wonderful, like students. Like the Stop Soldier Suicide people are really great. We've also been working with a few other entities. So I work with like mental health professionals at the University of Southern California. They've created a suicide-focused care pathway for their students that sort of replicates what we've designed at OSU. And so I meet with their therapists every single week to help them learn the treatments. We work with some private sector entities as well that offer telehealth and have suicide-focused care. So those are the examples of how we're trying to branch out. And then I've had some really promising conversations with like foundations and donors who are interested in that model to say, yeah, how do we now get to the next step? And so hopefully in the coming years we'll be able to do some more work with more agencies, with more organizations that want to adopt this like specialist care model.
So with that, I know I talked about going with other psychiatrists, other universities, but where is like a Department of Defense? Are you guys on their radar to take what is going on now? Because you're dealing with a lot of veterans that are out of the military I'd assume that most of them are out that are going through. Mm-hmm. Are you on their radar to be like, maybe we should be applying the Strive concept to, the people that are in, or maybe even like informing, people, because that's one of the things that we were talking about earlier is like, they tell you all these things in safety briefings, but no one ever talked about mental health and what was going to happen. And that was one of the things you didn't talk about. All they talked about was mental health was if you can't hack it, you're weak or whatever. But is the Department of Defense looking at what you guys are doing to say, hey, this is something we could be applying to the military?
So we actually have multiple studies right now, all funded by Department of Defense, that are really designed to try to figure out what is the best way to implement these interventions. And of course, the implementation is hard. It's like, so it's great that we know that this works, but what we find is that oftentimes organizational barriers, policies make it a pain in the ass to actually put it into real life. And so there's one, I won't say what hospital.
And the military is the worst at it.
Well, so I was on Secretary Austin's independent review committee. I guess we wrapped up about a year and a half ago. And on suicide prevention, this is one of the key things that we concluded is like the system, the organization is so bureaucratic, so convoluted that it actually gets in the way of itself. And so part of the reason that these treatments and interventions are not more widely available is because there's so many administrative and bureaucratic, hurdles that you actually make it nearly impossible for a military psychologist or social worker to do this. And part of that is, it's, the DoD itself. But part of it is also Congress. I was surprised how often I'm like, and I've testified to Congress a few times, I'm like, sometimes you should actually not impose requirements because you're actually making this worse. You're getting in the way. It's well-intentioned. I know you mean well, but this sometimes is actually working against your desired outcomes. And so sometimes it's actually better. I always kind of push back whenever I hear this mindset happens all the time in suicide prevention. Something's better than nothing. And my retort is always, sometimes nothing is better than something, because sometimes something is worse than nothing. And so we should be a little bit more cautious in just assuming that we should do something.
Yeah, that goes back to my whole thing, though, is that just, if you've never been in the military, that can't get out of its way on on simple things. So something like this, but I say this again, and I'm critical about it before, and I'll still be critical about it. Is they could get rid of these barriers, they can get rid of these policies if it was really important to them. And I think that's a part of it. It's not important to the right people yet, and that's what I get back before is like, when is enough? When is it? We have active duty Navy SEALs 06s, killing themselves in their office. That you have, it's something isn't working. So it goes back to the whole thing we talked about earlier. Is like, when are we going to throw out the playbook we're using and do it? And sometimes I look at it and like, do they really want to help us? Is this something they really want to, do they want to put all these people through this therapy? Do they want to make it from 200 psychiatrists to 1,100 if that's what they need?
Yeah.
And I mean, do they really want to do that? And what's really the benefit for the system?
Right.
I don't mean to be a cynic, but I think that's kind of how I feel sometimes about it. I mean, you would know the numbers, but I just feel like I don't remember suicide being talked about so much in my entire life.
Yeah.
And especially in a certain demographic of people that it's and we like to be number one, but I don't think the US, being number one in suicide isn't one of those things that we should be pounding our chest about or just like pushing aside and being like, let's get out of the top 10. Let's get out of the top 25.
Well, was overseas the last couple of weeks. And so having some conversations with some international colleagues, and I can't remember now who I was talking to, but someone from, I think a European nation. And they were saying like, oh, we need to do this more like the United States. And I was like, I don't know if we have the best track record on suicide prevention. It's like, maybe like there probably are things that could be done better.
Fireworks on 4th of July, yes, but our how we treat our veterans, let's have another beer and think about this one before you commit to that. So that was an interesting thing I want to talk about more. Is I was shocked by that. So how far ahead are we as being number one? And what do you, as a researching this, what would you say like are the top three? I mean, you could probably talk about this for hours, but what do you think are why we're leading that charge right now? What is it tied into the same things you're talking about now? Is there any type of like societal things that are so much different than we are than other countries, or
I think that probably. I mean, so for context, so what we typically talk about in the United States, and the statistics you're going to hear is like over the past 20 years, since like the turn of the century, suicides have been steadily increasing. And that is true. What's often missed is if you look at the long history, kind of the peak in the United States of when suicides were the highest are like the 1920s, 1930s, and then, kind of plummeted and then continued to drop and was steady for a while. And then in the 1990s, we actually saw this steady decline. And so, and then hit that valley and it started to reverse. And so I point that out only because I worry that sometimes when we say, well, over the past 20, 25 years, it has been going up, you have to kind of look at those numbers within the context of the past 100 years. And so one question that I have is, well, what were we doing right in the 1990s that we're not doing now, right? And so I don't know what the answer to that is.
I mean, you were skateboarding.
Skateboarding. We had some grunge music.
That's interesting. So let me ask you a question because I didn't research this enough. So you talked about 20s and 30s compared to now. How much are we higher than the 20s and 30s?
No, the 20s and 30s are still higher, but like now suicide rates are kind of like the highest level they've been since, I want to say like the 40s, 50s, something like that.
Yeah, like 2030s, I can see like Great Depression. The world wasn't a great place. And then.
Yeah. So there was,
the 90s, what was going on in the 90s? I mean.
It's kind of, and that's, again, it's something that people don't kind of think about. And then, so now that's kind of the US trends. And then, we can kind of place beside that international statistics, like what's happening everywhere else. And pretty much everywhere else in the world, it's down suicide rates are dropping. There are a few exceptions. And the US is one of about like 20% of nations where suicides have increased rather than decreased. And so that was kind of why when I'm talking to this international colleague, I'm like, whoa, hold on, maybe you should pay attention to what everybody else is doing, because that's probably where maybe some better ideas are going to come from. So I don't know, but I would say that, yeah, probably this trend and the fact that the US rates are sort of diverging from the rest of the world would suggest that there's probably something at a societal level that is playing some kind of role.
Right.
And I think, we have the storyline that I think has emerged is, there's a rise in mental illness, especially young kids and youths. The big thing now in the past year is like, the presumed connection to social media and screen time. But so I don't really know that any of that is the right answer, but there's something that has shifted in the past 25 years that would suggest that perhaps we should be looking a little further back in our history, because maybe instead of thinking what has changed in the past 20 years, it's like, well, relative to what?
Yeah.
And maybe there's something we could learn.
I mean, in the 90s, like if you were talking about, hey, it's not fair that because Johnny down the street got to do this, you're probably going to get hit by your parents are going to give a fuck, or you didn't even know that what Johnny was doing down the street. So the 90s were an interesting time of like, you didn't have instant, but I look at that when you look at the country though, when you say that, because I did, when I listened to that a little bit, I'm like, yeah, but in Europe, they have the same apps we have, right?
Mm-hmm. Right. Exactly.
Kids are doing the same thing. I mean, I don't think that like we're the only, I mean, maybe we are the only nation that's allowing kids to have like astronomical amounts of screen time, but I just feel like the whole world has changed in some of these things, but there's something about like, again, I mean,
yeah,
it just doesn't make sense. And I just thought that was interesting that I would think you were talking about like, what's like a country, like first world country, like lowest suicide rate, like lowest, like down there that you'd be surprised. Do you know that? Or I don't mean to put you on the spot.
Yeah. I mean, kind of historically, I don't know where the ranking is, but, like Scandinavian nations have sort of historically, had lower suicide rates. They have also really high levels of like quality of life and well-being as well. Yeah. I'm
regretting not looking at that because I could have been like, it is actually Scandinavia. No, no, but I'm not trying to put you on the spot. I'm just like philosophically talking about stuff, because that blew my mind when I heard that today. I was like, I didn't even think of that. I thought like the way you hear about it's got to be everybody. So now like you're talking about, we have everybody else going this way. I mean, it doesn't. Yeah. And it goes back to what you've been talking about this whole time is whose responsibility is it to start diving into this and figure out what's changed?
Yeah.
Right.
I
don't know. I feel like for me, I hope that I'm like passing on like a better mental health, like situation to my kids.
Yeah.
So maybe it's like the people in the 30s and 40s went through it. Maybe they were burdening it and taking it, and they weren't passing it on as, one of the things I've learned is trauma and all that kind of stuff. I don't know. I'm just, I could talk all night about why that was, but I mean, it's, those are the things that just shock me is like, there's statistics that are there. Like, why are we not?
Yeah. And that's
like super analyzing this. Like, when is enough is enough? Like,
well, for me, I mean, so, when I was writing the book, part of what, was motivating it was, just sort of noticing, over the course of my career, like things didn't add up. Right. And so there are these like statistics that we just kind of spout off all the time, these assumptions that we have about suicide. But then when you really look into it, you're like, that's not the whole story, right? Mm-hmm. And so like here's another statistics that actually I share a lot with like the patients that I treat who come in for care. And I find this happens actually a lot in younger generations. So like early, like transition age adults. Where there's a lot of misconception about like mental illness and suicide. So I'm thinking right now of a young woman that I treated 6 months ago, something like that. And she had this like suicidal crisis. She went to the hospital, was intervened, and then we initiated mental health care pretty soon thereafter. Towards the end of therapy, she was doing much better. And so we were kind of preparing, okay, we're going to wrap up therapy soon. So what comes next for you, right? Let's plan for the future. And I remember her saying at one point, kind of like, well, I'm always going to be this way because I had the suicidal crisis and I went to the ED. And so I'm kind of like marked, right? And I've found this mindset a lot actually in younger generations. And I say, well, what do you mean? Like 99.9% of people who have suicidal thoughts do not kill themselves. And she was like, what? I was like, no, like almost everyone who has suicidal thoughts actually recovers. Sometimes it takes a while, but very few people actually die by suicide. And it sort of like blew her mind. And because I think the way we talk about suicide in our society is like, if you have a suicidal thought, oh shit, like, yeah, now you're marked and you're doomed or something like that. When in reality, if you have suicidal thoughts, there's actually a good chance that eventually things are going to get better. And it might be hard and it might take a long time. But there's actually a lot of reason to think that it's going to eventually be okay. And so I've likened in many respects suicidal thinking as being kind of like our internal smoke detectors. And what I mean by that is, in my experience, in my life, every time the smoke detector has gone off in my house, it's because I'm burning something in the oven. And so the smoke detector alerts us that something's not right.
Or the steam in the shower.
Or the steam in the shower. Yeah, there you go.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, so you better figure out what's going on because it could be a disaster. But almost always, if not always, it's not a disaster. And we could fix the problem, and open windows and turn on fans and stuff like that. And so I think sometimes thinking of suicidal thinking and suicidal ideation that way is actually really helpful because when you're having those thoughts, that's your signal. Something is not right. Things are not going well. And this could be really bad. So let's figure out what's going on. What's the source of the smoke, of the distress, and let's start working on fixing that problem. And most of the time, you actually don't have to call the fire department, right? It's actually something that can be managed, something that can be fixed. And I think that mindset I have found in the patients that I work with, people who have survived suicide attempts, is really valuable to them because, number one, it kind of instills some hope for them, but also it helps them to realize that maybe this is something that I had that's a part of me, it's a part of my past, but it doesn't define my existence.
Exactly. And I was just going to say that, hey, you talked off camera, I've talked on camera before. Hey, I've had suicidal ideology. It's a part of me. It's not who I am. But for a lot of time when I was messed up, like you said, that's what I thought. I thought that there was something wrong with me. There was, I was broken, right? But guess what? It's not special. I mean, a lot of people have that feeling. And the worst thing you can do is, we talk about the fire extinguisher. To me, is like taking the batteries out of the fire extinguisher, getting rid of the fire extinguisher. It's there for a reason. Like it may go off 4 years from now, but like you said, something's going on. Don't remove that. Yeah, because that's when it can get really bad for you. But yeah, I mean, if anyone's listening or does listen, it's okay. That's okay. But that's our societies. They don't want to talk about that stuff. They don't want to. People are more interested in talking about, like tonight, the draft. Fantasy football's kicked off. That's what social media wants to talk about. They want to talk about who drafted who, what's going on, but nobody wants to talk about what the important stuff of how people aren't doing okay. And a lot of times you have to understand, not everyone is doing great. If you talk to them and you're open to the right people, and you can't tell everybody that, but you're not alone. That's the big thing about that, and that isn't a stigma that has to live with you forever. It's something that happened in your past. It's a part of you. It doesn't identify you. I mean, but that takes a lot of time to understand. It took me a long time, but especially in a society where like you bring that up and what happens to you, I mean, all of a sudden your friends are talking about it. There's all this kind of stuff and there's a stigma that's associated to you. Mm-hmm. And then you find out that same person was making fun of you a month later, they take their life. It's just a crazy cycle. Yeah.
It's one of the, I would say one of the biggest lessons I've learned, spending the last 15 or 20 years focusing on suicide prevention. And I've learned this from my patients is that, in many respects, like sort of suicide prevention is all about finding your internal braking system, right? Because it's like you're like speeding down the road towards that brick wall. You need to do something, right? Or disaster is going to strike. And so you have to hit the brakes. And that is in many respects the most important part of suicide prevention, is taking that moment to just pump the brakes, slow yourself down, just for a few seconds, for a few minutes. And that actually makes a really, really big difference, because that wave, that intensity of that despair, of that darkness that comes, sometimes, man, it will sideswipe you out of nowhere. And it is overwhelming, but it is a wave, and what goes up must come down, and it will pass. And so that braking system really is your way of saying, just hang on a second, let's tread water, and let's see what happens here. And I've said to more than a lot of patients around this, I'm like, you have the rest of your life to kill yourself. I don't know why it has to happen right now. Just hit the fucking brakes.
Yeah.
And you can stall the decision. You can always make the decision later. And first off, patients are usually just stunned that I said that to them.
I kind of like that. I'm like,
yeah,
oh,
but
I needed more people to tell me that. Yes.
Yeah, no, exactly, actually, and I think it's on my mind actually, because I just told it to one of my patients like 2 weeks ago, and I was like, just like, you can kill yourself later. It doesn't have to be when you're really upset. And for her, she was like, holy shit, like that. You're absolutely right. And it's like, that's what I worry about. Like, I worry about in those moments, you're like going to deprive yourself of like a really good life, because it's so intense and so overwhelming right now. It's like, just hit the brakes, right? And wait, it'll pass, and we'll see what happens next.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I have that. I mean, that equates to just, I think, that makes 100% sense with suicide, but also just like, but that's hard too. I'll speak for my, you might be diagnosing me a little bit. That's okay. But like for me, I like disconnected the brakes for a reason. I had to disconnect those brakes for a reason, because I needed that, or those brakes where I didn't disconnect them, or they were disconnected because of some type of trauma in the past. But I think that's the interesting thing is, it's an instant thought of like, why like for me, it was like, why am I getting so fucking mad about why my sons didn't put away the laundry? You know what I mean? Like this rage, like this it just happens. I don't even have to think about it. It just happens.
Yeah, 0 to 60, like super fast.
And all of a sudden, everything that's going great is the whole day is awful because somebody didn't do that. And like you said before the break, I haven't, called a break, but just like, it's like, for me, it's like, just take a time out. Like I know now, like when I start feeling that, I just disappear. I try to just disappear, like go away, meditate. Meditation's been huge for me on that. Just step away from that, because for some people that happens. People don't understand that. I don't think my wife understands that sometimes. It's not something that's an excuse, maybe that's a story, but I haven't been focused on stopping that in the past. It just happens. It happens really quickly without me thinking. So I have to put, I have to also understand I can't go 90 miles an hour.
Yeah.
It's not just the brakes. I got to be like, I got to slow down. But a big thing that when that happens, like I'm telling you, for anybody, when as bad as you think it is, just take a deep breath, talk to whoever you can talk to. It gets better really fast. As quick as that pain comes up, it can be relieved just as fast, and be like, for me, that's what I found is I just speak for myself, but that's how it is. Like I've been to the point of not wanting to live anymore, to be like, and I could talk about it and process it and catching myself. And all of a sudden it's like, everything is okay.
That is, when, because I'm often asked, like with like these therapies that we've developed. So like one of our therapies, it reduces suicide attempts by 60% as compared to traditional mental health treatments. And we keep finding this over and over again in our studies. And so people ask, well, like, what's the secret, right? What are you doing? And I think part of it, what we're starting to learn, so we've got a new study right now at OSU that's helping us figure this out, is we're sort of like helping people find that internal braking system. And like this new study that we're doing with a collaborator of mine, she's a neuroscientist, so she does like the MRIs and all this kind of stuff. And what we're seeing is she does like these imaging like before and after the intervention. And what she finds is that the things that we do in these treatments activate parts of the brain that kind of function as the braking system. And so that's why I've just always loved it. It was a veteran that I treated probably a decade ago. He was the one who came up with the whole, braking system metaphor. And I was like, man, that's fucking beautiful. I'm going to use that now for the rest of my career.
I mean, using the same term, it's a little bit different than like, me coming out Save Your Warrior, which I think is a lot of similar things you're doing before. That's, it's a different terminology, but exactly what you're talking about. This, I think definitely, slowing yourself down, not going 90 miles an hour is the first thing. And then understanding, fixing the brakes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Knowing that the brakes work, and it's sometimes important to hit the brakes. It's exactly what it is, because in some aspects of our life, as in the warrior class, it's like we didn't have that. You couldn't put the brakes on. Everything was telling you to put the brakes on, and you can't do that. Like there's cops and first responders and military people today that they can't put the brake on today. Everything is telling them that they need to stop or slow down, or it's the worst thing they've seen, but they can't. Yeah. Right. They can't at this moment, but there's other things they can do later on. It doesn't have to always be that, 90 miles an hour down the left lane. Mm-hmm. It's okay except when you're really driving, to be, cruising to the side. I still think we should be able to drive 90 miles an hour, but it's a whole different thing. So we talked about, I think we touched on it, but one of the things I wanted to talk more about was, we were talking about why people haven't figured this out. And I may be getting this wrong from, some of your topics, but you talked about the wicked problem, mm-hmm. which was a concept that was described in a 1973 paper by Horst Riddle and Melvin Weber, meant to characterize social policy problems, which are notoriously difficult to solve. Wicked problems are distinguished from the conventional problems by their high level of complexity, rendering them especially tricky to solve. This inherent complexity results in constant change, which reduces the probability that any particular strategy will fully address the problem. To this end, wicked problems cannot be definitively solved or completely eliminated, and especially unsettling and uncomfortable perspective when applied to problems such as suicide. Solutions to wicked problems, therefore, cannot be right or wrong. Although some solutions may be relatively better or worse than others, this means that there is no one thing we can do to prevent suicide, and there probably isn't a best thing or most important thing that we can do either. So I kind of talked about it. I just want to bring that up, and maybe you want to elaborate more about it, but it kind of hit home about the wicked problem, mm-hmm. being like what we were just talking about, what that issue was. It is a problem. It is a wicked problem, but in your mind, do you think, you touched on, again, you may have nothing more to say about it, but what do what else do you think we need to do to solve this wicked problem of suicide? You talked about some other things here, some problems. I know you have some things that you're working on. You have another book that dealt with, the BCBT, mm-hmm. Brief cognitive behavioral therapy, all those things. Like when I read that, it was like, I didn't like the wicked because it reminds me of Boston. I hate anybody from Boston, New Yorker, but it changes the whole word of wicked. But,
wicked problem.
Yeah, it is. And that's what I'm saying is, like, I just feel like it's just like everybody at this point should be just throwing everything on the wall and hope it sticks. Right. Yeah. And if it doesn't stick, it just needs to go. It's like it just needs to be wiped off the whiteboard or whatever you want to call about it. I mean,
the idea is, and I found this, when I stumbled into this notion of wicked problem, I was like, oh my God, this is really, really, I think, right on for suicide. Because I do think that a lot of our efforts are really, focused on like finding the magic bullet, right? The one thing that will work. And it's hard because, I get asked by journalists a lot. I get asked by like military leaders, what is like the thing I could do? And I have to try not to roll my eyes too hard. I'm like, well, there is no like single thing that you can do. And that mindset is part of the problem. And so this issue of the wicked problem then is that, there is no solution. First off, there are only strategies. And when you implement a strategy, part of what makes a wicked problem wicked is that once you act upon the problem changes. And so now the strategy that was working in some cases doesn't work anymore or reveals a new problem that didn't exist previously. And so what this means is that in order to tackle wicked problems, you have to use a variety of strategies. But you have to continuously monitor the effects. Because if something is not working, you should stop using that, right? Because you're wasting resources otherwise. And then when something does work, not only should you preserve it, but you have to continue to monitor the problem, because that working solution could now fundamentally change the problem itself. And so it becomes something different. It morphs. This is actually, I've posed this as perhaps one explanation why suicides of the past 25 years have increased relative to the previous decade. I've wondered, like, is suicide a different thing than what it was 20 or 30 years ago? Like, are we trying to prevent something that's fundamentally different than what it was when we were kids? And I don't know, but that's sort of one of the implications of thinking of wicked problems in this way, that the things that used to work don't work anymore because it's wicked. And we have changed the nature of the problem itself.
Yeah, I think when you read that, I mean, I don't think we can. I mean, hell, I wish we could solve it right now.
Right? Yeah.
We'd be the world would be a better place. But that paragraph to me, when you read it, and that part, there's another part that goes into that. It clicks for me when I hear that. When I hear that's why I want to bring it up, is like, but what it goes back to again, it's like what, and this could be addressed to everybody else. Like what's going on with suicide gonna be enough is enough? When are you going to realize that it is a wicked problem, that everybody needs to be involved? It's, I've heard different crazy shit. I've heard people be like, oh gosh, like, veterans can only help veterans. I can't relate to this, or like all these, like these weird things that have to do with suicide. It's like, this is all of us. I mean, this isn't just, it's a certain focus of, and I don't want it to be, this is what we talk about here is the warrior class and veterans, but there's 14-year-old kids that are taking life. There's 13-year-old kids. There's mom, there's 30-year-old people that have never seen, the trauma that we see as veterans and warrior. But like, when is enough? When is that general going to stop asking that stupid fucking question of what one thing can I do to get everybody to fix everybody? That you have to change that. It's not one pill, right? Or one, session that's going to go there for a month and you're going to be okay. What's helped me through Saul is, it's a continuous journey. It doesn't happen when you leave and it's over with. It's something that continue to do. Like, I'm going to leave the podcast. I'm going to go up and read, 15 pages of something. And that whole process tomorrow, things that gets me to, like you said, find my, my internal brake system, or to move away from how I was feeling, or to cope with those things are different. But when is everybody to see that as a, as a problem? That's what shocks me, because a lot of people just think, oh, if you take this pill, get on this medication, you're gonna be fine, or go see Craig for 3 months and it's over with. We know that's not working. It doesn't work.
It's part of the kind of the core critique of suicide prevention from my perspective is that we have pigeonholed it as a mental health problem. And so from that perspective, when we talk about like, well, suicide prevention is everyone's business. It's like a cliche in the suicide prevention community. It's like, well, what the hell does that mean, that it's everyone's business? Because if it's only about mental health, then it's sort of like, I think, removes accountability and responsibility for taking care of one another. Because like, oh, we just need to get you over there to those clinics and those hospitals so that the doctors can take care of you. And so I found it useful to think of suicide prevention as, promoting and fostering lives that are worth living. When people are kind of teetering on the edge of, am I going to attempt? Am I not going to attempt? Am I going to do it or not do it? They're kind of weighing in their mind, what is the value of living relative to the value of dying? And so if living is not worth it, if it does not carry enough value, it makes suicide a little more probable, right? And so what that means for all of us is, okay, how can we address quality of life issues every day? And so when I work with like commanders, or even like in the corporate world, I talk about this with like corporate leaders, say, actually, what you could probably do to prevent suicide is poll your people and say, what are the things that drive you nuts on a daily basis? The shit that just drives you crazy. And what you're going to find is there's going to be little things. It's going to, so here's a great example. When we were on the independent review committee for the military, what the number one answer to what's the most stressful part of your job was? Ooh. You're going to love this. computer systems. It takes 30 minutes.
Fucking cat card to
It takes 30 minutes for my computer to load in the morning. My email doesn't work. Teams doesn't work. All this stuff. And so here's the funny part. So we're in the Pentagon. We're like briefing all this stuff. And, as soon as
the system shuts down.
it was like, as soon as I would say, every like high level Pentagon person would be like, oh my God, that drives me nuts. Yes. And I'm like, look at how this is. It's like, so it's those little things that wear you down. It's death by 1,000 paper cuts. And so how do we kind of prevent suicide? How do we all take responsibility? It's like, well, what are those little things and what are the steps that we can take? Sometimes we can just get rid of those problems. Let's eliminate them. But other times we can't get rid of them, but maybe we can buffer people or protect them a little bit. That's actually how we can prevent suicide. It's help each other have meaningful, good lives. Yeah.
No, I mean, that's hysterical about the computer because, like, you go to work and it doesn't work. It sometimes happens an update and it's like taking 15 minutes and you're like, God damn, my computer's not powered. And then you open up and you have like 80 emails and you're like, fuck, I got 80 emails. Like, you're so fired up to get into something that you know is just going to cause you more anguish and heartache.
Right, exactly.
I've never had that happen to me. No, I mean, but living a quality life is what, the last thing, one of the videos I was watching talk about that was towards the end. I didn't get to write it here, but I'm glad you brought that. That's kind of what I was leading to is, I think that's the solution, right? To me, that made the most sense of all the things you talked about is figuring out what a quality life, and a quality life is what's a quality life for you. You know what I mean? It's not what somebody else is doing. It's like, that's one of the things that, my journey with Save a Warriors, that's what it's doing. Have a quality life is doing what's important to me that makes me feel good. That, why do I meditate? Because why am I meditating every morning? Because I told somebody a couple months ago that I was going to do it for 60 days, but
right.
That's, no, but I mean, I find, now that I do that, it's like you talked about before, that changes something, that puts a different mindset on the day, that contributes to me having a quality day. Right.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Yeah.
There's things like that. Those, just as I, and the guys we travel with and talk about the little things that bother you, there's little things you can do, small steps that you can do every day that are going to lead to a better quality life. It's, it could be for you not drinking. It could be meditating. It could be, cold showers. It could be exercising every day. It could be reading, reading drawing, books, whatever thing. That's what you have to find. And
watching
I think
silly comedies on Netflix.
Not doing it like binge watching, but you've done all you're supposed to do. Is it funny to, we've changed it with, death scrolling on Instagram. With my wife and I, we sometimes will do it. And then at night we'll look at 15, for 15 minutes, look at it and laugh, and we're both laughing instead of, each one of us, doing it. It's funny that way. But I thought that was a huge thing you said. And I think that's a key, and it's worked for me. And I think that's the message that has to get out. That message is in other different places, but it just has to be like brought together, because I think, telling somebody just go see Craig every Tuesday, take this medication.
Yeah.
And focus on the bad things isn't helping. Find something, and it's a little thing, just like the computer, like getting fired up that somebody cutting you off.
Yeah.
Right? Have I never cut anybody off in the car?
Right.
Yes. But when they do it, they're a complete asshole. When I do it, I'm completely justified. I mean, there's these crazy things, but just to find the good that works for you. And I think that's for me, it's been a transformation and a journey, and that I'm dedicated to, because I found for me that once I find the good in what's going on, it just changes the whole day. Like don't get me wrong, I still get pissed off on my computer not opening up. I still freak out about that, but it doesn't overwhelm my day. Or there's a lot of times I can say, knock it the fuck off. It's a good, it's a good day. So find these small things.
And small things, not only for yourself, I very much encourage people to like do small things, like develop rituals like that you do for others as well. And so, might be, everyone does it. Like for people who are married, like I think of like a ritual that my wife and I have where it's like in the morning, I get up and make coffee. That's like just my thing. I do that because I usually get up before her, but then on weekends, she gets up before me and makes the coffee. And then when I'm on the road, I wake up in the morning in a hotel, I send a text message with a little coffee mug emoji, right? Yeah. Because it's sort of like symbolic. It's a ritual that we've engaged in. Those are little things that are not only good for myself, but it's also a communication to someone else that you matter,
Right.
that you're important. And those are the things that we can do, like the expressions of gratitude. And so one of our trauma therapies, we actually have an assignment that's really impactful where we tell people to go out and to thank other people, express appreciation a minimum of 3 times per day. And here's the other assignment: you have to receive all expressions of appreciation and gratitude from others. So which means I usually have to teach my veterans how to do this. It's like, so if someone says something nice to you,
You have to say thank you.
thank you, and then shut up. Like, just zip it, right? And then that's usually like, oh man, and so, but that, that giving of, I appreciate you, and also when you thank me or appreciate me, say, yeah, thanks.
Yeah.
That was nice, man. Those are other like little things, as these are transactions that build quality of life.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, my wife, I try to always put her coffee cup under the Keurig and just put the pod there.
Yeah.
Which, could I brew that and carry up to her? Yes. Am I going to do that? No. But I mean, no, I'm kidding. I've done that before, but yeah, that's just me saying, hey, like, hopefully when she comes down, exactly what you said, like, okay, all this stuff and run out, he was still saying, thinking about me. Yeah, it's important. I mean, those little things do matter. I've had it. One of my spiritual gurus had me do the, reach out for 90 days and tell everybody what you appreciate about them. That was probably, I didn't make it, Jake, by the way, the 90 days, because it got hard after you get to like 16, 17, 18 people that you're just randomly texting or calling, be like, hey, Craig, I just want to tell you, I really appreciate, 5 years ago, what I mean? Like, it's just a weird, but for me, the most uncomfortable part, that was, I'm attaching a story to it. I would say that's the hardest part. The hardest part for me was exactly what you said, was when it came back to you. And I got to a point where I got, and he's going to know what I'm talking about if he listens, is that's where I got rackety and stopped doing it, because I was like, oh, I don't want this person to think that I'm just reaching out to them to have them say something nice to me. Right.
Yeah. Because
that's how I started feeling. That's a bullshit story. I just got hard for me to really think for 90 people, but I definitely, it worked for me to understand what was going on, because like, I found out what I do now, instead of that 90 days out, is if I'm struggling with something, I just reach out and text somebody and tell them thank you, or call them and say, hey, I'm thinking about you.
Yeah.
And that helps me with how I'm feeling negative about myself. Because to be honest with you, sometimes it feels good for you to say, hey, I really appreciate it, and for them to say something back to you. That's a pretty good even exchange if it's really sincere from both people.
Exactly.
I mean, I don't promote like just
the sincerity
telling people
matters.
You have to be sincere about it, but it's not like, but it's important. It's a good transaction. I have it at that, if you do that, but it could be hard for anybody to say. I found it's gotten harder just for people to say hello to people.
Yeah.
Like, that's one of my biggest pet peeves. It's in the morning, you walk by, good morning, how you doing? People just don't ignore you. And that is like that. Yeah. It's not my problem. I know they're having a bad day, but I'm just like, wow, because it's such an easy thing to give. It's such a, say your day's bad. Maybe I can help you, or maybe talking about feels better, but it's a crazy, but I think that's changed, right? I mean, you talk about societal changes, that's happened, right? Yeah. I mean, kids, like, you talk to kids, if you were my kids were 9 years old and you walked up and said hello to my kids, there was an expectation that at 9 years old, they were going to say hello, Mr. Bryan, or hello, like, and acknowledge you. Now, I mean, you could talk to 12-year-old kids and they don't even respond to you. And parents are like, oh, they don't like to talk to people. Or, you got me thinking about the 90s. If you'd have done that, I feel like, and if you didn't do it when you walked away, your parents were like, you say hello to them. You don't call him, Craig, you call him Mr. So, I mean, I don't think that's the key reason that this is happening, but that's an important thing. It's a transaction, a human interaction to people.
I mean, there have been these like societal shifts I've been noticed, like with younger generations. So they're more risk averse than, older generations. And so the good news about sort of increased risk aversion amongst youth is they're less likely to use drugs, they're less likely to have promiscuous sex, kind of all these like bad things have declined. But there's also perhaps the counterpoint to that is part of the part of the riskiness sometimes is like testing limits, to know sort of what your boundaries are. And so that can lead to like overcautiousness, which is ironically a risk factor for suicide. And so, but there's that. And I get asked about like the social media thing all the time. It's like, I don't know if that's like it per se. But what I will say is that one thing that has changed in society as a result of technology is kind of like instant gratification. And so it's like, I mean, you think about it, it's like, I'm hungry and and then it appears at my door 20 minutes later, right?
Doesn't matter that I paid $17 for that.
Yeah. And think of how frustrated we'll get. Like you text someone, they don't write back within 30 seconds or something. And so here again, like that instant gratification, that inability to wait is also kind of like a risk factor for suicide. And so there are these like changes that perhaps maybe are underlying these these undercurrents of increasing suicide. And that's where, sometimes again, when I'm kind of working with like groups and, different entities and organizations, I say, there's little things that matter. But some of how that might translate, this is something I bring up with military leaders a lot. Stop texting your people after hours. And there's some great military leaders, thinking right now of General Beagle, who kind of made waves several years ago when he was the garrison commander at Fort Drum, when he kind of issued this policy of like no contact with your subordinates after duty hours unless it's an emergency. And he conceptualized it as he called it training management. It's like, if you're not managing your training schedule well enough that it's 9:00 p.m. and you're like texting your people or WhatsApping them in the middle of the night, then you're not actually doing your job as a leader. And so you need to manage your time better and stop disrupting your people's. And it was like, it made waves within the military, and other installations and commanders kind of followed suit. And I think there's something to be said about that of, like letting people kind of be on their own so that they're not on call.
There's the last thing you want to hear is from your company commander at 1:00 in the morning.
Yeah. Because some good idea fairy has.
Hey, so
never mind, we're not doing that anymore.
Idea. Well, I mean, it traces back to like my time with like family day. It was like supposed to be, it was like Thursday. Everybody's supposed to go home at noon. Yeah. And like nobody was, I mean, so many people were violating that. I mean, I think it was Hood when I was out there is one of the brigade commanders walked through and caught like a bunch of officers around, and he was like, next, officer I catch. I think it was Colonel Lynch. Yeah. It was like, you're like, we're getting Article 15, like get out of here. But like nobody, I felt like even in that time frame, we were still you just get out of here. I don't care what you're doing, but we weren't making sure that our, I know they weren't going home, because like half the time we would go hang out, and it would be an excuse to go hang out with your platoon sergeant or other NCOs and go drink, or, it was like, nobody was going home. They were just, there was no family time going on. But yeah, those things definitely have to change, and the mentality. Yeah. But I'm glad I'm not in the Army where like WhatsApp and all this kind of stuff to be able to get that. That would just, that would be one of my paper cuts.
It absolutely would. And, a point that I've even made this, like when I think of this in the university setting, like with students, where I've, had urgent, students getting really upset because they like sent me some email at like 10 p.m. because of some crisis for them. It was a crisis, and I didn't respond. And, the next day I was like, well, what were we going to do at 10:00 p.m.? Like there's nothing to be done. The university's not open. Right. And so in that sense, there's no need to, because you have an idea and access to a keyboard, that doesn't mean that we necessarily need to, kind of send a message to one another. Here's another kind of internal brakes, just pump the brakes, and it'll be okay, because we're not going to solve this until the office opens up in the morning anyway.
Yeah. It was interesting what we were saying though, is, I'm 50, so I didn't grow up in the age of the instant gratification, but it quickly it's grabbed a hold of me.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
So what's even scarier is that like there's kids that never knew that, to be able to look around and be like, okay, it isn't okay to spend $17 on a $4 burger.
Right.
Yeah, it is. Yeah. There's nothing that, and I found myself during COVID, we were doing that. We kept, we were worried about that, but when we're like, I say we don't talk about COVID, but when that happened, at some point I was like, I'm going to do that. But we were like Grubhubbing stuff, and it was like, oh, I mean, I ever charged a Grubhub to my dad one time. I didn't change the credit, but you look, it's a true story. Actually, I think it was twice, wasn't it? I think he finally was like, I was the Chinese food. And I was like, how do you know we have Chinese food? He's like, because you charge it to my damn credit. Because he was, for some reason, it was a funny story. But I think that's an interesting thing is we have the capability to kind of step back and be like, is this that important?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And I struggle with it because I talk about Amazon all the time.
Yeah.
Like I talked about Amazon. I thought Amazon was the craziest concept. It was never going to work. Who the hell needs this pickle by 4 a.m. tomorrow morning? Right.
Yeah.
Now, if I can't get like the most obscure thing next day, I'm like, fuck yeah, I'm gonna order it from somewhere else. And then if I can't get it in 2 days, and I know I can drive to Home Depot, people don't do that. We don't go do that. We just want to bitch about not being able to get it the next day. And then the other part about it is like we can wait to the last minute to do something, and then we're all pissed off that we waited to the last minute and we can't get it, tomorrow, and you're all irritated with the thing. But that generation growing up that way, they don't know if it's grabbed a hold of us that hard. Like, what is? I mean, my dad's like that. To be honest with you, the phone takes over his life. With when it comes to baseball, like he's been over there watching the Yankee game. He always does that. Like he's down there doing it. Like it's his focus, right?
They're not playing.
That's why he's not over there today, but he's normally on it. But that's what I'm saying. So maybe that's an idea of like that. When you talk about they don't know any differently. It's just, and then when it doesn't happen, they don't have that ability to step back and be like, it's really not a big deal that I can't get Taco Bell delivered to me right now while I'm playing video games for the past 4 hours. You know what I mean?
And it's, like you said before, it's like it's taken hold of, all of us. And, so I think what that means for those of us who are more, senior, we're leaders, we're bosses, supervisors, things like that is, we have to pump the brakes sometimes as well. And so I've like I think for myself, I kind of set a rule for myself several years ago that it's like I don't do emails on the weekend, especially when it involves like students or subordinates, because I don't want them to feel like that they have to respond on a Saturday or something like that. And what I found was that once I kind of set that rule for myself, it actually worked out pretty well for me as well, because it's like out of sight, out of mind, I'm off. Right.
Yeah.
And that is, I think, an important part of, resilience.
Yeah. It is interesting. You just got me going back to the original about what was different about the 90s.
Yeah.
I'm thinking total difference with just the suicide part of it, but like the life was just, I feel like it was like a lot easier. You didn't know what was going on, right?
Yeah.
You only had 10 channels to look at. You didn't have 200
as
of them,
as you say that, I was, I don't know if I was reading something in the past week or something about this, but it was like, it was sort of like a tolerance of boredom, because you were just like, well, there's nothing to do and there's no one to call. And so now if we're bored, we just pop out the phone or something like that. We surf the net, we doom scroll, all that kind of stuff.
Like video game. I watch all my kids' videotape. They're all connected. Like how was us? It would be 3 of us that you have to wait your turn. If it was a 2-player game, if you're lucky. Like, you had to deal with some, but you wonder, like all joking aside, if those things do really start to manifest, the small things that you learn, that it's like, you know what I mean? Like it is okay not to be talking to something. It is okay just to be by yourself and to be nothing going on. That's okay. Like, you don't have to be like, hello, is anybody, I just feel like, that's, and the other thing for me, what I've thought about is like, for me, was like opinions. I feel like the new world now, the social media just allows me to have opinions about everything. Things that I really don't have an opinion over, but I feel like I got to have an opinion about it. Right. You know what I mean? But I just think, I wonder if those, you talk about that was a time where like you were home, like when you got home, like you didn't talk to your, like a girlfriend or boyfriend because your parents could take the receiver off. There was no way to do it. There was no like sneaking your phone. There was no, just so many things where you learn restraint or how to deal with not getting your way. Right. That's kind of scary because we've been through things, and I find myself just as wrapped up in something sometimes that, my 19-year-old is, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
But it's you wonder if those little things are really have a lot bigger effect that we make, we make memes about it, we talk about it.
Yeah, well, it's like they accumulate, they interact with each other, and they snowball. And so, it kind of harkens back, I think, again, of when we were briefing, the kind of the conclusions of the independent review committee. I remember Secretary Austin about the like computer system thing. He'd say like, so are you saying that if I like buy new computers, that's going to like reduce suicide? And he's kind of saying it in an edgy way. It's like, no, that's not what we're saying. But what we're saying is that this is something that wears people out. And this combined with a faulty voucher system, combined with, pay mess ups, combined with housing issues.
My boss WhatsApping me at 4:00 in the morning.
Exactly.
And wanting you to get on the email that you can't get into. Like, I mean, but when he says that, do you really, and I'm not being critical of him, but any leaders, are they really seeing, is that really his solution to it? Does he really think that way? Or is it just because you don't understand really what, to look at it in a different way? Because I can totally see that was my general saying, or like, the Secretary of the Defense saying that, okay, we need new computers because
my read of it was that a lot of the recommendations were not what he was expecting. I think what we were presenting things in a way that was different from, I think, perhaps what he had in his mind. And so that sort of comment, that question was kind of reflecting this of like, really, this is what it is. And then once we were able to explain it, he got it. He understood what we meant. And it was actually in this process, this metaphor that I use a lot. I don't know, maybe you've seen it in like one of the talks online, but I talk about like this gardening metaphor of suicide prevention, which is, if we're farmers or if we're gardeners and we want like a bountiful crop, then what we have to do is, we plant our seeds, but then we have to water the soil, we have to fertilize, check the pH levels, take care of pests and insects, and get rid of disease processes, all those sorts of things. If we do none of that, if we just plant the seeds and do none of that, then probably those flowers and crops will wither and they will die. And if we then were to conclude, well, I just don't have resilient enough plants, I need better seeds. No, that's not the correct conclusion. The correct conclusion is we're not good farmers. And so if we want to have a bountiful crop, we have to create conditions, that are conducive to thriving. And that's in many ways where like the computers and, voucher systems and all these like annoyances in life, that's basically akin to fertilizing and taking care of, the pests. And so I think that's been kind of particularly in the military, I think a mistake over the past few decades of we're just going to like resiliency train our way out of this. I'm like, well, what you're doing is you're in essence blaming the service member for not being, strong enough to withstand shitty conditions. And so instead, let's tend to the environment and make it easy for service members to thrive and to grow. I will say it doesn't mean that we remove all stress from their lives, because stress is what makes us stronger. But it's, being able to have enough savviness and enough nuance to say, this is a type of stress that's harmful for people versus this is a type of stress that's, actually going to be conducive to people hardening, to strengthening, to getting better.
Yeah. Because I've been guilty of that too. When I was a leader in the military, like when something was struggling, you just said, suck it up, drive on.
Yeah.
He's doing fine. What's your problem? Probably use some other words that you shouldn't have used, but looking back, that was the culture for a long time. And I still feel like it can be the culture in some other places too. It's okay not to be okay. And I think that's one of the things where I'm glad you guys are, talking to high level people about this. But that has to trickle down, right? The mentality of, you have to really look back at that and those things they're telling you. Did they probably affect a 4-star general? Maybe not. Or, maybe he isn't having the problem of his computer booting up or the pay stub issues. Like, you got to look at what's really the trigger for other people and understand how that can be a problem for them. And as a leader, I was awful at that, because you just have 100 and some people and you expect them all to deal with that way, the same way the stress is the same way. And if you didn't, there was something wrong with you. In reality, a lot of people weren't okay with what you're doing. They just were afraid to say something.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. I have a lot of courage for people back. I look back at that we're struggling and said, hey, I need to pump my brakes. I look back and I said some awful things to people, but I'm like, man, that took a ton of courage. Like we talked about in the beginning of whoever that kid that's opened the second door in high school to let everybody else in. It takes a lot. It's not easy, but we definitely need to be pushing it. So with the exception of your gardening thing, mint. No matter what you do to mint, it keeps growing. At least in my backyard, I can't get rid of that thing, man.
I'm not a good gardener. So.
No. I was thinking about that.
I'm a gardener of people. I'm not a gardener of
I haven't watered that mint. I haven't done anything, but it pulled it all out. It comes back. It's all back there again. So if you need mint, let me know. I'll bag it up. I'll give you a bag before you leave.
All right.
So one of the questions we've talked about, you talked about other people. You talked about the process that you've seen and what you're doing. Have you ever personally struggled with PTS or suicidal ideology or depression? Have you ever found yourself going down that road or?
Yeah, so not post-traumatic stress, but yeah, I've had some moments where I felt like I was at my wit's end, and you kind of think like this isn't worth it anymore. What's the point? And it's kind of interesting because it's not, it's not like the classic like suicidal thinking that we typically think of, like I want to kill myself, but like the research that we do now, like we found that there are these other sort of mental states that are characterized by this, like I can't do this anymore, and I just like nothing is going to fix this problem, and I'm not worthy of living anymore. Where those are thought processes that are actually very, very high vulnerability for suicide, even though it's not the S word, right? And so, there definitely been moments where, I've kind of felt stretched to the limits, and I've thought that I'm like, man, what the fuck is the point of all this? And so, you have to kind of ride the wave in those moments and recognize that, this too shall pass. And it might be hard and difficult, but there are other things in life that make it worth it. Yeah.
Did you talk to anybody about that, or just kind of use what you knew in your own?
Yeah.
Your own.
Yeah. So
you've got a lot of being able to check yourself, hopefully put your brakes. But was it something where you had to, talk to a colleague or
Yeah. No. So I have a wife who works with me, is in the business, right? And so so kind of going through it together, was really important, and but also having really good friend network, and so I'm going to return to the mentor that I had early in my career, where there was some really bad moments, and I called him up and said, here's what's going on. And in his true like former Army self, he said, he's like, you got to cut that shit out and get the fuck out of there, man. And it's like, and it's just that realism and the support, and someone who was more, has more life experience than me to kind of, validate the experience and say, look, like you're going to be cool and we're going to help you and all that kind of stuff. And so, so not the kind of professional assistance, but I guess but at the same time, I'm kind of surrounded being a professional. I guess I get the benefit of, the expertise of many of my colleagues and friends.
Not just ask because I think the reason I asked that question is obviously it's important for, I think, anybody to hear that you're not immune to it, even though this is your profession and you're an expert at it. You still, everyone's no one's immune from this. So that's basically, and I appreciate your honesty on that. There is one, I know we're approaching, a little over 2 hours, which is okay. But the one thing I did, one more thing I wanted to talk to you about was your interest that when you were talking about suicide being considered a mental health issue, like that means if you're the only people, you have some stats that you showed there's stats that say that 90% of people that commit suicide are mentally ill, whereas the real study, if you look at, that's really not the case. It's like 45.
Yeah.
And you, in some of the things you talked about, you said that that's could be a kind of a misconception that could be causing suicide prevention or some of the treatments to not be received as well. Is that right? Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah. So I reference it in the book. I call it the 90% statistic, and it's this, this number, this idea that we just regurgitate all the time. I've done it plenty of times myself when I was doing the suicide prevention briefings when I was active duty and all that kind of stuff. And it's, 90% of people who kill themselves have a mental illness. And it was while I was deployed, and encountering all of these like near misses, suicide attempts, things like that. I write about a Marine in the emergency department that I evaluated who had like, missed, but had all this like, gunpowder, muzzle powder on his chin, all this kind of stuff. And, but he had no mental health problem, no diagnosis. I mean, I spent an hour or two with him. We sent him to Launch Stool, and, he was there for like a week, and they're like, there's nothing going on with this guy. What the hell? And I just kept encountering that over and over again, which really got me to kind of question, like, where did this 90% statistic even come from? And so, I posed the question on a listserv of suicide researchers and advocates and stuff like that. And nobody knew where it came from. Like, I don't know. It's like, 90% of people who kill themselves have a mental disorder, and the sky is blue. I mean, everybody knows that, right? And so I tried to track down the statistic for about 2 years and couldn't find it. And then it was actually another suicide researcher who found the source. And it was a study that had been published in the early 2000s that was based on a method, a research method that's actually known to be highly biased and flawed, and that overestimates rates of mental health diagnoses. And so this like sort of core truth about suicide, that almost everybody who kills themselves has some kind of like a psychological disorder, is based entirely on a single study that uses a method that has been shown to overestimate mental health conditions. And so what all that means is, part of the reason I think we're not better at this is that we're shooting at the wrong target. Only about half of those who kill themselves have a mental health condition. The other half don't. And that other half is kind of interesting. They have a unique profile. They're more likely to be men, and they are more likely to have life stressors like relationship problems, financial strain. And they're also way more likely to use guns to kill themselves. And so there's this picture of like there are different types of suicides. And one of them is basically reacting to bad circumstances in life and having access to highly lethal methods that create this sort of perfect storm. And so that's a group of people we're going to have a really hard time reaching if we keep this mindset of it's all about mental health problems and warning signs and things like that, because we're totally missing the target. And so I think that's a big miss when we think of it as it relates to military personnel and veterans, because it's 85% male. 70% of the suicides involve guns. And it's just like, we're just in essence kind of missing the boat.
All right. And you talk about that study. Is that the one we said where you're looking at after they pass away, doing an autopsy, a psychological autopsy.
That's exactly right.
And then you're looking at, okay, Che did have, this happened or whatever. And then you're equating that, limited, not talking to me, just what's happened in the past, he's suffering from whatever.
That's right. Yeah.
Illness. So, yeah, I mean, I thought that was important to understand, because that made a lot of sense when I was reading that on my color code. That's true. You're looking for, because I think it's easier I have that too. Not only, I would think it would be that you wouldn't want to be biased for the psychologist to do that. But I think for us, even as a person that's dealing with it, we want that to be the truth too, in a way, because it's easier to accept that only people that are mentally ill take their own life. I think that's an easier way to, like you said about not being a problem. You know what I mean? There had to be something mentally ill with them for them to do that. And I think that's an easy out for a lot of people, not to dive into what is really the problem. Like you just said, why we're aiming at the wrong thing. It's hard to accept, for some people to accept why it is. They're not mentally ill. They're just having, they're in distress, and they didn't have a way to do it, and they didn't know how to process it or whatever. They made a bad decision.
Sudden, it's intense. And the mindset often is like, I'm overwhelmed and I can't take this. And so in that sense, it's sort of like people look for the eject button. And here again, the profile is you have this access to this highly lethal method, and it's like, bam, it's done. And so it's kind of the underpinning of like kind of thinking about this in a totally different way of not tying it to mental illness, but also recognizing that, perhaps other very simple strategies as simple as just like how we store our firearms at home actually could save a lot of lives. But we're kind of like afraid to talk about it.
Yeah. I mean, I brought up a long time ago, and this is I haven't said this in a while, but I have it now even more that if you are a veteran who is suffering from PTSD, diagnosed and getting money from the government, I don't think you should have access to a firearm, because I feel like you said earlier, I feel PTSD is something that can be cured, right? So it's not a forever thing.
Right. Yeah.
But that's very unpopular. People are like, what, I do believe in.
Yeah.
I'm an American. It's okay to have guns, but I just feel like it's exactly what you said. It's almost like, it's a very unpopular opinion, but I see that if someone's 100%, if you're getting disability rating for that, and we know that this is something that's very, instantaneous.
And what I would say is,
but everybody gets mad in a different way. Like, oh, you can't do that. But like, I mean, I'm not saying they never get their guns back, but I also don't think, and this is a very unpopular thing too, is I don't think you can have to suffer from PTSD for your whole entire life. I think it's treatable.
Yeah, very much so.
I've done. So, and that's a mentality that people don't think. I think you can go 20 years and then you can go to the government and say, I'm okay.
Yeah.
But that's a very unpopular
it is.
opinion. So.
It is, and it's hard to talk about. And I would say, so those watching, those listening who don't agree with that perspective, I would say, so I would propose maybe another alternative, which is if you don't like the idea of like sort of like the complete removal or not having access at all, I would encourage you to consider the merits of safes and lock boxes and other locking devices, because it's crazy when you really look at the statistics of households that use safes and locking boxes and other locking devices. They have a 50% lower suicide rate than gun owning households that have unsecured firearms. And so it's just like quite literally just where and how you store your firearms actually makes an enormous difference.
Well, you talk about firearms, it gets people fired up.
Yeah.
I mean, that may do that, but let's talk. I want to get off that. I want to put some more data in that.
Yeah.
Like we talked about our country, we do have access to guns, but there's other countries that have eliminated other things.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
Can you talk about those other countries that have said, okay, yeah, we don't have a gun problem in Australia, but we have this problem. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Yeah,
there's like two requirements. So the whole thing. So here we're talking about like a firearm storage, safe storage, because that's in the United States. The majority of suicides involve firearms. Amongst veterans, about 70% of our suicides. So there's kind of like two rules for security precautions to work to prevent suicide. The first rule is the method that you're targeting has to be sufficiently lethal and dangerous. So it has to be easy to die as a result of it. The second rule is that it has to be used a lot within the population. So it's not rare. So that's why kind of guns is the thing in the United States. It meets both of the rules. But in other nations, it wouldn't apply. And this is what I hear from people all the time who worry about this. It's like, well, in Japan, they have like no guns, but they have a high suicide rate. I'm like, right. And so we have to take a different approach there. So in Indo-Pac nations, in the 1980s and 1990s, had really high suicide rates. And it was because primarily it was male farmers were drinking pesticide to kill themselves, and they were storing their pesticides inside their homes. And so the governments of like Sri Lanka, Indonesia, Malaysia instituted these programs to encourage farmers to store their pesticides outside of the home, and then they would give them like padlocks to lock it up. And then what the government also did was they banned the most toxic additives in the pesticides, because their logic was, well, we can't get rid of all pesticides. That's a non-starter. We can, however, make pesticides less dangerous. And so the combination of those, move the pesticides outside, lock them up, and then make them less dangerous, reduce suicide rates by like 70%. It was like crazy how effective it was. We've seen in like Scandinavian nations, paracetamol is a painkiller that people would overdose on a lot. And so they just told doctors, stop prescribing this painkiller, use something else. Suicide rates dropped. UK, in the 1950s, 1960s, the primary method of suicide was carbon monoxide poisoning, because that was the domestic gas to heat your homes, to turn on your oven. And so Parliament said, hey, let's maybe stop pumping carbon monoxide into people's homes. Suicide rates dropped. And I think the most relevant finding, arguably, for kind of our topic of like veteran suicide and gun suicide is the Israeli military. The early 2000s, the Israeli military had a high suicide rate. They tracked their numbers and they found that it was most of their suicides were occurring on the weekends while people were at home on leave and they were using their firearms. And so the Israeli military, they just instituted a new policy. And they said, at the end of the duty week, go to the armory, check in your gun, go home, do your thing, then come back at the start of the next duty week, go to the armory, get your gun, go do your job. They found that one change in policy, locking up the guns, reduced firearm suicides by 70%, almost overnight. And because guns were the primary method of suicide, the overall military suicide rate dropped by almost half. And so, again, it's like, if it's lethal and it's commonly used, when you take steps to reduce convenient, ready, quick access, it's like the only thing that consistently and reliably prevents suicide.
It'll be a very unpopular topic, but I don't care. It's fine. It's fun to talk about.
Yeah.
So we've covered a lot. Anything that you want to talk about your books, research that you think we didn't touch on?
No, man, I think we covered a lot. So no, I appreciate the conversation.
Oh, the same. I'm honored to have you in here. It's been great. I'm sorry I didn't read the book before, but I'll get it knocked out, the rest of it, all the way through. I promise to do that. We got to talk about, we got to lighten the mood a little bit.
Okay.
Though. So we have a couple people that are part of our group, part of the board, that are huge smokers. Like, we know a lot of, like, we're not talking about smoking. We're talking about smoking meat.
Oh, okay.
So one of them's out here, which is pretty funny. He'd loving this, but like, what kind of smoker are you using? What's your brand smoker? Do you have one at home?
Yeah,
we have to have one.
Yeah, we have a Traeger.
Okay.
Yep.
Right.
Yeah, pellet smoker.
All right.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right, Traeger. Traeger's a popular answer.
Yeah.
That's one of the things. I have a lot of friends that are good at it, so I don't have to do it. So you can reap the benefits of it, but I don't have the patience for that.
Yeah, so
I just don't like getting up at 7 o'clock, put in the morning, put in there.
Okay, so here's
going
how
out there brushing it down. I'm like, no.
Here's how I learned this. I actually learned it from another psychologist who actually used to live in Northern Ohio, but now he's in New Mexico, and he used to post it like on Twitter all the time. Every time he was barbecuing, because there'd be like this mass exodus to Northern Ohio to go to his barbecues. But he would actually start smoking the night before, and just let it ride overnight. And once I learned that, I'm like, that made all the difference in the world.
We have a couple of friends that are like competition smokers, and I'm just like, and I've been fortunate to go there, and when we've done some charity things and get to watch it, and just the last one, all I want to do is eat it.
Right.
Like,
yeah.
The guys are running up there taking pictures of it, and I'm just like, are you gonna get up? I'm like, it's a fucking rib. It's a slab of ribs. They're. It's just one of those things. Trust me, I've been close. I've had a smoker in my almost buying it, and then I'm like, I'm more into the Blackstone now. I like the griddle.
Yeah,
that's more my speed. Kind of instant things happening. You know what I mean? It's fun. So the other thing is craft beers. So you're a craft beer guy.
Yeah.
Okay. Top 3 craft beers in Ohio.
Oh, in Ohio. Oh man. I'm going to admit I don't know if I know all.
Or just
the
any craft beers.
Yeah, there is. So was it Hops? Hop Slam. It's actually a Michigan brewery. Yeah. So when I moved here to Ohio 4 years ago, so I came from Utah, so very different craft brewery scene, right? The first time we went into the grocery store, we're like, oh, like beer, But so I had not had Hop Slam before coming here, and that's my favorite. So it's seasonal. And so around the holidays, I usually go to the grocery store and pick up as many cases as I can carry out. So that's definitely at the top of my list. I actually like Bodie as well, which is I think that's a Ohio brewery as well. And then we live in Grandview Yard, and so we walk to kind of like a local craft brewer. So Endeavor Brewing is just like half a mile away. So we like to just walk there and just, sit down, enjoy some of they have one. What is the beer that I get there? Shaka, which I don't know if you ever were a Star Trek: The Next Generation fan. Yeah, so Shaka When the Walls Fell, and so it always goes.
Is it are you an IPA?
Yeah, I'm an IPA guy. Yeah,
okay, cool.
Yeah.
Have you had Who Farted at all?
I have not.
Okay,
no.
I'll have to hook you up after this. And my number one favorite craft brewery, Zaptic. I'd have to throw it out there. If Jim is ever listening, I had to throw
Zaptic.
Zaptic. You remember Zaptic? We'll talk after.
All right. Yeah.
Come on, Dan. Come on, everybody.
Yeah.
We'll talk about that after. We'll try some of the. I think that comes after stuff. But that's the great thing about Columbus. There's a lot of great Columbus.
Oh yeah.
Craft beer. I'm an IPA more guy, so.
Yeah. No, it's we've loved living here. So yeah, that's something I like doing. And it's just so like our research group, every once in a while we'll like get together. We call it paper in a day, but what we'll do is we'll like go to breweries around town and just like come in and sit and just work on like papers and stuff like that. And so it's like a lot of fun. So.
Have you ever had Hetty Topper out of like the Vermont?
No, I haven't. Yeah.
I'm going back in a couple weeks. I'll bring it back. That was one I thought was really great. I'm going to be driving, so I'll be able to bring it back. But that used to be the crazy hazy IPA thing.
Yeah.
So I'm interested to have that and see if it's as good as I thought it was. It's been like 5 years, but I'll probably be like, it's not as good as I remember it to be. And they come up with some excuse about how it's brewed differently or some bullshit, but it is what it is. But
yeah.
Well, we did cover a lot. We could probably keep going. I truly want to thank you for everything you're doing. Thank you for your service, even though it was very brief. I think, like you said, it was very impactful. I know you were super impactful on all the airmen that you served. And thank you from the bottom of my heart that suicide and PTSD and that became your life's work. Mm-hmm. And it's a real honor to have you on here, and I really thank you for doing that and keep up the hard work. And I love where you're at with your vision of it. Not that it matters what my opinion is, but I think it's just really great. Your look on it, it's amazing. And if anybody out there, if you haven't read this book, just from the first parts that I've read, you have to grab it. We'll put a link up to it. It's on Amazon, I'm sure. Right?
Yeah, absolutely.
You need to get it. Read it, because especially if anything that Craig's talking about that is resonating with you, you need to listen to that, and you need to start spreading that word, because I think some very powerful things are in there to change the dynamic. I'm with you 100%. We need to erase the way we're doing things and find out what's working. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
Thanks for coming on, and we're going to get to the not so great part of the evening. Tonight we're going to honor a veteran who unfortunately took their life. Sorry, I'm a little slow on this, but I'm operating solo here. But tonight we're going to honor U.S. Marine Colonel Jim F. Turner IV, 55 years old. Jim was born on September 15th, 1963 in Baltimore, Maryland. Jim took his life on December 10th, 2018 at the Bay Pines Department of Veterans Affairs Complex in Bay Pines, Florida. Jim graduated from St. Paul's High School in Baltimore, Maryland, and the University of Charleston in Charleston, West Virginia. After graduating from college, Jim commissioned in the United States Marine Corps as a Marine aviator. Jim flew the F-18 Hornet and then transitioned to become an infantry officer. Jim took part in the invasion of Iraq in 2003 and later served in Afghanistan before spending a decade working at the U.S. Central Command at MacDill Air Force Base. Jim received countless accommodations and medals for his outstanding inspirational leadership and service. According to his superior officers, Jim left an enduring legacy of professionalism, commitment, and superior leadership, which served as a guiding force for all service members whose lives he touched. He had a life that was worth emulating. Jim is survived by his beloved children, Jimbo and Kaylee, brother and sister-in-law, John and Katie, sister Jane, his children's mother, Jennifer, nephews, Christopher, Ian, and Maddie, and numerous other relatives and friends. And if you or someone you know is in crisis and might be considering suicide, please contact the Veterans Crisis Hotline at 988 or 1-800-273-8255 and press 1, or text 838-255, or you can now chat online at veteranscrisisline.net/chat. So again, I'd like to thank you for coming on. I was trying to find a quote to end it, because 3 books for you. But I found a different quote that we're going to end tonight's episode on. I think it'll hit hard with you, but and it's something that you should probably know because he's talked about this the topic. We talked about a lot of things tonight and how it's changed. So it comes from Carl Melanthus, who wrote the book What It's Like to Go to War. And the quote is, and I think that it's the military has actually made improvements. So people are considering post-traumatic stress disorder as at least a possible psychological problem. When I was in Vietnam, it was just considered malingering, and now we're making progress. So I thought that was a pretty interesting quote from that book, and kind of talked about what we're doing, because everything we did talk about, it's got to get better. But I think your brothers and your sisters have changed the game. I just, pray every night and hope that you guys do find what moves it from 60 to 100% and find the root cause to end this epidemic. So I want to thank you for that. Again, thank you for coming in. Thank you for your service. And let's have a couple beers after we get off the camera. So we'll see everyone in a couple weeks. I think we're going to have 3 weeks. The bad thing is weey're going to have another Air Force person come in, but it's going to be a really good episode.
It's going to be a very, very engaging conversation.
Another Air Force person. I don't know. That flag's got to stay up there for another
We'll bring
few
a
weeks.
dictionary
We'll see everybody.
for you, okay?
We're going to have a little bit of a break again. We'll see everybody on September 26th. We're going to be joined by Mr. Jake Day himself. I'm looking forward to the episode. So tune in. Thank you, everybody who tuned in and is listening. You guys have a great night and a great week. Thanks.